are all related concepts. And so, these sentences are starting to become, I don't know, they're each actual sentence he writes is surrounded by a field of possible sentences he could have written that also would have conveyed the same ideas from a different angle, because the terminology for talking about these things is so complex, as we've discovered. So he talks about spirit, but he also talks about ego, and sometimes he'll use one term and sometimes the other. And of course, we know that there's a Verstand is another term that he could be using there, or noesis. And he'll talk about the soul, or he'll talk about the irrational unconscious parts of decision making. And of course, we know that's also tied up with experience and begriff and gnosis in these complex ways we've been exploring together. So I had to reread this chapter today before our session and just take my time with it, looking at each sentence, going, "Damn." he's always connecting the history of philosophy into everything he writes. He's not always coming out and saying he's doing it, but you can see, once you've done enough of these essays, you can start to pick up. He doesn't have to actually say Heraclitus's name or Kafka's or Hegel's. He can still be invoking them, and it really informs the reading. So when last we left our intrepid heroes, we had about wrapped up in soul and spirit and ego. We'd about wrapped up soul and market, and spirit and soul is just an aside, really. 7.2. It's a side comment that he makes before he digs into responding to the question that's raised in it, Joshua's question.
Well, I didn't take it as a sigh. I took it as an essential part, at least in terms of what art tries to do.
Oh, he sets up everything there. I agree.
Yeah. So I think at least from that context, it seems like that apparent similarity also has its differences, which is very, very important.
Yes.
And I myself, I think that part of the essay actually helped me. I would hardly say that helped me understand my art, but adds another dimension to the understanding, So that was important, because I was there, but I didn't know how I was there, and I think this added to it.
Yes, he in 7.2, he really just, Joshua raises the question, and Kenneth really spends the entire rest of the essay answering it. This is where everything branches off from, because this is where, when Joshua says, he was discussing spirit and soul, and he's trying to work out what they mean to him and how they convey, that's really the rest of the topic for this.
Well, let me say something about that. When I was reading through that, I was thinking actually more specifically not about visual art, but about music. And it seems to me Wagner had a lot of spirit, and Mahler had a lot of soul. But no, actually, I'll bring up a third guy, Bruckner. I was always interested in Bruckner, but Bruckner, I believe, had a lot of soul, but he wasn't able to harness enough spirit for it to come out. So therefore, his music seemed like there's something under the water.
Yes.
You feel that it is there, and it's very mysterious, it's very interesting. And once in a while it pops up briefly, and you say, oh, no, it disappears. Right? And I think, well, you might be deep into it, but you're so hidden that it's hard to communicate it. And I think Mahler took that part and added enough spirit for it to surface. And so the interiority was what Bruckner and Mahler was about. But Mahler had enough of the spirit of Beethoven to bring it out. Whereas like Wagner was so external and projecting that it really was overwhelming. So you do not have a chance when you listen to it to appreciate your own soul
Mhm.
manifesting. And so that's why, even though I think Wagner was very important musically, uh, because he did a lot of stuff with harmony and all that kind of stuff that was important, it always seems something that is a bit performative and theatrical, and I would say bordering what bordering on a spectacle rather than a true expression of art.
Yeah.
So I think that's why Wagner's spirit was so available to the Nazis, because of that externality of it. I'm not saying he's a Nazi, but I
Right.
think there was something about uh, exceeding expression of the spirit to the point that it overwhelmed the interiority to externalize itself. That's why I prefer Marlowe. Marlowe essentially dealt with similar harmonies, but it's just so much deeper about the interiority it's just beautiful, Whereas Bruckner is like, uh, you know, you keep waiting for it to come out and say, well, help me, and it's like it disappears. Like he's like a
Yes.
submarine. So
Yes. We're gonna come back to that. That's some potent stuff you've raised there, and of course, you know, Kenneth talks about Beethoven and Tchaikovsky here in the context of soulishness. So a discussion of hi Stephen, a discussion of music is and composers is entirely on point. But let's I see Sharon's got her hand up. Go ahead, Sharon.
So I'm sorry I missed all the pleasantries, but I hope you're feeling well, and I'm happy to see you back. And so if we're talking about 7.2, is that where we are?
Yes, 7.2, and then we're going to go on to 7.3.
So he says, not to be confused with the kilted clansmen, yaxmen of Ren and Stimpy fame. So can you clue me in as to why he mentioned that?
So he's being playful. He's just talking about a friend of his who has a name that's got the same lilt and structure as a cartoon character from Ren and Stimpy. That's all. This is Joshua raising a question and having his tongue in his cheek while he's doing it. He really wants to talk about soul and spirit, but he's sort of playing a little bit with his friend's name.
Okay.
And Kenneth runs with it for a moment just because he actually met one of the creators of Ren and Stimpy, and so Kenneth may write with a vocabulary that clubs you over the head sometimes. That makes you think that he must be pompous and take himself seriously. But the guy's a joker. He makes friends with cartoonists and he loves a good satire.
Having grown up watching my son digest Ren and Stimpy, and so did I just wanted to know what was the relevance here.
Yeah, well, Ren and Stimpy pushed the boundaries of impropriety.
Exactly.
At least that part came along and sort of nuked the whole terrain. But one of the things that was amazing about Ren and Stimpy that's relevant to what Phil was just saying is that it was one of the first animated cartoons in like a decade or more that took classical music and used it as the soundtrack regularly.
Correct.
It's like those of us who grew up on Bugs Bunny and other Warner Brothers cartoons got a real education in classical music just from watching this play that was set to classical music. And for all it's being having booger jokes and all kinds of other stuff, Ren and Stimpy was also set to classical music, which was even more sort of disorienting when the subject matter was not matching with the something that we normally take to be serious. So that's kind of put both Joshua and Kenneth in this essay into a spirit of playfulness and goofing around a little bit at the same time that they're being serious. Okay. So, but the question that's raised after that, is you can see that Joshua is talking about trying to feel out the relationships between gnosis and soul and spirit and intelligence. And, he's feeling out the things we've been talking about in this. We're now, are we in week 28? Sweet Jesus, it's week 28 of going through Mythos and Logos. You know, what are these different concepts and how do they relate to each other? And that's the ball thrown over the plate that Kenneth decides to swing for the fences with for the rest of the essay. It's like, yeah, let's talk about this directly. And that's why this essay is in this collection. Aside from the fact that it, you know, tangentially uses the words mythos and logos from time to time, mostly it's that even when it doesn't use the words, it's talking about the underlying issues of gnosis and noesis and how that manifests into Begriff and Verstand and Benousoi and Douloi and culture. So the whole foundational system is kind of being sketched in here in response. So other questions about 7.2 before we go on to 7.3? Now 7.2 is very short. All right, so let's go into 7.3 where he starts answering this stuff. Because right off the bat, he uses the example of somebody who is a miser in his everyday life, but when he goes to church, he gives, maybe even generously, which would seem to be out of sync with his day-to-day character. And Kenneth's using this as an opportunity to talk about, kind of to illustrate the way that Begriff and Verstand are operating in us at exactly the same time. That we are, you know, like we said when we were sort of doing diagrams, if you're drawing a thought balloon of somebody thinking, you really need to draw 2 thought balloons, at least, and maybe 3, but at least the 2 for the 2 basal faculties of the metabolism of the mind, because the brain is simultaneously producing experiential reasoning on the one hand and formalistic reasoning on the other. And then the mind as a whole is trying to reconcile the 2 to decide what it is you think, as though there were only one thing that you were thinking. And this understanding that there is a fundamental schism, that the brain is working on both tracks at the same time, and they're sort of competing for interest for who gets to be the thought I'm having at any given point, it helps to explain why somebody who might be greedy in their conscious, planned, strategic life, when they step through the doors of the church that they went into since they were a little kid, now they're operating on a sub-rational, subconscious, ingrained traditional level that's deeper than the level that they're operating on in their day-to-day life. And the mind is fully able to switch modes without ever alerting the person doing it that that's what's happening. He himself may never have realized that his behavior in the church is completely out of sync with his behavior in everyday life to everybody else, because the brain switches so smoothly between these faculties. I mean, we are very, very young when we are first developing the ability to offset our conscious reasoning with our experience of life and flip them back and forth smoothly between each other. It's one of the things that we're most proficient at, to the point that we forget that we're doing it. And as adults, whether we're philosophers or neuroscientists or psychologists, when we're attempting to tell people how the brain works, even though we ourselves are doing this thing, and even though we are so trained to try to understand how the mind works, we overlook this because we've been doing it for too long. We don't even know we're doing it anymore, which of course takes us back to Gnothi Sealton and the difficulty of knowing yourself. So the better you are at something, the more proficient you are, the less aware you are of what it is you're doing, which is why so many people who are very good at things can't actually teach it to anybody else, because it's all been pushed down into that unconscious automatic level that makes them so good. So I just thought I'd start with that opening paragraph, just because I was sitting there looking at it thinking, there is a lot to unpack in just this paragraph, some of which we'll come to anon. Sharon, go ahead.
I have to be totally non-philosophical here.
Yeah.
About the miser and the dual behavior, in my mind, that's what I call hypocrisy, right? And I think it's not so unconscious. I think people do it. And when you talk to people who are atheists, when you talk to individuals who are atheists, that's one of the things, one of the factors that they discuss. So it's interesting to hear a philosophical take on it, but a practical, observational, pragmatic approach is just your awareness, your consciousness, how developed you are. That's my take on that one.
Yeah, I mean, Heraclitus, his argument is that we're sleepwalkers and that most of the things we're doing, we're not aware that we're doing them. Even when we are consciously thinking and evaluating things, there's an enormous part of what we're doing that's unconscious. Mm-hmm. And we don't, which presents what seems to be a contradiction. How can we be unconscious when we're seemingly at our most conscious? Because we associate the use of Verstand with consciousness. We sort of misunderstanding how the brain works, we equate the two. And then we think that if we're reasoning, that must mean that we're fully awake now. But of course, that's not the case at all. This is Hegel's argument that both of these modes are basal modes. They're both hardwired into the brain. And so you can do both of them without having the slightest hint of self-awareness. And you need self-awareness to rule out hypocrisy, right? I mean, if you're doing hypocritical behavior, you have to wake up enough to look at the sum total of the contradictory parts of yourself to notice that there's hypocrisy going on. And up until that moment, if you haven't done that, does it even rise to the level of hypocrisy if it's just sort of sleepwalking and just flipping roles back and forth and never even knowing you're doing it? When you're trying to, talk to somebody who's doing these behaviors, these hypocritical behaviors, and you're trying to make it visible to them, if we start with the assumption that they know that they're doing it and they're doing it on purpose and they should be ashamed of themselves, they're going to push back immediately because, of course, they have no idea they're doing it. They don't know that these things don't go together. They don't know that there's a contradiction. And if they did know there was a contradiction, they wouldn't think they were the person doing both of those contradictory things. They just literally can't put the pieces together because they're too busy living their life to look at their life and understand it in such a way that would be required in order to see the hypocrisy of it. But part of what's interesting about human beings is that we are so good at mode switching that we mostly don't know we're doing it. Marianne and then Phil.
I wanted to point out the pre-individualized modes of motivation, which implies to me that we really are social beings, and we get a lot of peer pressure to do things that we may not ordinarily do, and usually it's for the benefit of the group. Or I had to say that there's also the racism and things like that. So, but it is a social behavior kind of thing. And yeah, feeling validation.
Peer pressure, you're right, is another excellent example of this subject, because sometimes people consciously evaluate whether or not they want to go along with the group and what it would mean, what the consequences would be. But sometimes they just go along with the group as a way to resolve uncomfortable feelings, or even because they enjoy it without ever having become conscious enough to stop and think, oh, am I doing this because this is what I choose? Or am I doing this because people expect it of me, or what? There's this whole level of self-awareness that's required to do anything with peer pressure other than to be a symptom of it. And I think just about everybody who studies philosophy must have, at least during their adolescence, have struggled with this issue of what does the group expect of me versus what do I want to actually do that? Should I go along with the group? That whole, just because all your friends jump off a bridge doesn't mean you should, is something that goes right over the heads of a lot of people growing up. But a certain percentage of people go, that's a really good question. I wonder if I should go off the bridge just because all my friends are doing it. To be interested in philosophy in the modern era, you have to have, at least at some point in your life, decided that you weren't always going to do the thing that was expected of you, because we're expected to be anti-philosophical as moderns. Phil and then
yeah, I saw it slightly differently, so I might be off track, but I don't think so. I saw it more abstractly. Mm-hmm. I remember previously I had brought up Anaxagoras, right? And I want to go through that just slightly and then realize that he was not self-critical enough. And Anaxagoras was part of the a group of the Pythagorean group, which believe in mathematics as related to the universe as a whole. But he brought a different dimension. He says the world, I guess in those days meant the universe, is made up of the limited and the unlimited. Okay. And that they're interpenetrating, they're woven together. And he says, there are many unlimited things that we do not know the mathematical proportion to, but there's a possibility that we could someday figure out the mathematical proportion, and they would become knowable, right? I think that in a funny way, that is actually where modern science has got themselves into. They have opened up that unlimited world in one sense, but it's still within a circle of the limited world. And they have not talked about what I would call the unknowable Tao as part of the universe, right? So they are expanding the universe, but they are bringing it in, they're actually kind of refining the limited world to more and more detail, so it becomes more and more believable. And they do not understand that there's the other part that's unknowable. You can't speak about it. You can't do it. It somehow enters into existence. And I think that's where science, in a sense, has finally figured out to criticize the forms is evolving, but it's just sort of tweaking the forms to a more and more refined matter. So you could say infinitesimal calculus, but they have not expanded outwards into another dimension, which perhaps mathematics cannot capture in some way. So there was actually 3 parts to his thing. I think he only saw 2 parts. There's the limited, the possible expansion of the limited into a larger limited, and then there's the unlimited. And I think he didn't actually criticize the unlimited as being somehow part of existence, but he just thought that it was not complete enough in the limited aspect. And so there was not enough self-criticism of the structure of the limited itself. So in that sense, it failed to actually be self-critical, which I think science is, except I think Niels Bohr is different. Niels Bohr finally broke through that, because Niels Bohr said, like, in the final analysis, it is really poetry. Which is it's an amazing statement. He talked to Heisenberg about it, like, it really is just poetry, because we have no idea what it is. All we could do is tell this mythic, poetic impression of what it is, which is like, wow, that's a scientist. Like, wow, that is actually revolutionary.
That's a high caliber thinking right there, right?
Yeah, right.
Yes, I'd say.
Yeah. These issues of the finite and the infinite, the finitizing and the infinitizing, of course, are all over these topics. The as we've said before, part of what makes Begriff and Verstand finitizing, self-limiting forms of mentality is that they both turn away from the infinite qualities of the cosmos to try to reduce it down to something finite that they can grasp. And they do it in a different strategy. In the case of Begriff, the strategy is to be open to the experience of the cosmos, which contains infinities within it, but then to think about it later only in terms of the part of it they themselves have experienced. So they have a parochializing approach to dealing with the infinite, which is we're not going to worry too much about the things we haven't experienced, that we haven't felt, that we don't remember. Whereas, the Verstand, with its systematizing approach to thinking, it solves that problem. It deparochializes itself by stretching towards infinity, but it requires infinities to map onto its schemas and systems, its mechanized approach to thinking, which rules out most of the experiential value of life, including what's important and right and wrong and things like that. It all gets mapped into, you know, rules and systems of calculation. And so as a result, you end up with this sort of empty infinities that lacks the rich quality of reality. And so it too is missing infinity. It's what I can't remember, the Greeks used to talk about the bad infinity versus the good infinity. And so like the fact that the principles of life express themselves everywhere, and every place they express themselves, they do it differently because each thing adapts to its own circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, they're also all in transition, changing to become something else. This kind of triple infinity is the good infinity that makes all of life possible. But the analytical stripping away all the values of things to make them fit into our schemas of thinking, you know, is the bad infinity that just endlessly repeats without actually coming to life. And in this way, they both turn away from infinite aspects of reality in order to seemingly enclose the whole world into one of these two modes that make sense to them, both of which end up being, you know, Ouroboros, the serpent turns back and swallows its own tail instead of moving on. And so it's the thing that most typifies Vernunft. And the thing that Aristotle is supposed to be searching for is that we're trying to uncoil those modes of thought, you know, that have been distorted. Both gnosis and noesis have the capacity to reach beyond these encircling infinities, but only if, you know, you uncoil them. You don't let the griff do what it wants to do to gnosis. You don't let Verstand do what it wants to do to noesis, but you open them back up to be answerable to reality again, and reality will keep reminding us of its infinities within infinities within infinities and dilating our mind to expand it. So, you know, you see when you read this essay or any Kenneth essay where he really grapples with these issues, that he's going to constantly be alluding to the unlimited, to the infinitizing, and contrasting it with the finitizing. I'm glad you brought it up, Phil, because it is one of the recurring motifs in this that makes sense out of it. But Ginny, you've got your hand up. Go ahead.
I'm just curious, when your brain is multitasking mentally, I'm wondering if it uses the same brain cells as when you're multitasking physically and mentally. For example, when I'm exercising, I exercise every morning. One of the things I do is work with weights. And I am doing my weight exercise. And then I realize it's my arms are doing these things, but then and it would just go through the motions, but I was not concentrating on focusing each movement as I was going through one after another. So is it just muscles that has its own memory, or is it my brain multitasking at the same time? I don't know.
We're still trying to figure it out. You know, it's part of what's so fascinating when you can look at certain disciplines in science and say that they feel like they've got the basic ground figured out and they're working on the edges. Chemistry is one of those, where they're like, well, we have most of the elements of the table that you're likely to encounter on a day-to-day basis. We understand a great deal about chemical reactions. Yes, there's plenty to still discover. There's plenty of new substances, but they feel like they've at least got the center of the discipline sorted out. But then you look at subjects like neurophysiology and neuroanatomy, and it's like, we're still trying to even see everything. And we're still developing different stains to let us see the structures. And then when we see the structures, we're still trying to work out what they mean. And how does this translate into the things that we are able to do in our day-to-day lives when we're exercising while thinking? It's like, well, which parts of our nervous system are engaged, and how are they engaged, and exactly how do these things manifest? And the answer is we're still trying to figure it out. It's a deep mystery, you know, and it's a reason why Heraclitus, even though the Greeks didn't have any real understanding of the physiology of the brain and how it worked, they were coming at it from the other side of mapping behavior in the mind and what did that imply. But even so, he could say, you know, the thing about the human soul, which encompassed the concept of the mind as well, is that this is not an easy topic. It's just huge. And he says you couldn't explore the limits of the soul even if you went by every possible path for your entire lifetime. You'd still have just scratched the surface of trying to figure out how in the heck are we able to do the things that we do. And of course, it takes me back to Hannah Arendt. with her quote in I think it's The Human Condition, where she talks about, as moderns pushing the limits on some of this, it becomes more and more obvious in our everyday lives that we are unable to clearly talk about or think about things that we're nevertheless able to do. And that creates an enormous problem for us, because it means that we don't really understand ourselves or the consequences of our actions. And so it's telling that she meant it in the context of atomic bombs and space flight and the industrial harnessing of civilization. What is this all going to do in the long run? And of course, we don't have the language to really think clearly about those things. But as you're sort of pointing out, Jenny, we don't even have the language to think clearly about thinking. What is it that we're doing when we're trying to think about these things? We don't really have that figured out either, so all we can do is do this kind of Smithian approach of trying to get more than one model in the hopes that from other models we'll see things that the first models were missing. And with enough of that, we might vaguely triangulate onto truth, whatever it may turn out to be. We'll see. So is it Phil, then Joseph, then Marianne?
Oh, Joseph first. Joseph
Okay.
first.
Yeah, just really briefly. Actually, I think David actually already put something in the chat with the idea that multitasking is kind of just a myth in general, which is actually interesting in and of itself, because
Yes.
it's this myth that we use to explain how our brain works.
Yes.
But then we can actually get to the science aspect of it that allows us to understand that we're actually just switching. But in that process, though, is the myth allowed us to start to ask the question as to what that actually, the difference to make the distinction that we're not our brain isn't multitasking, that we're switching, and that you can perform science based on the idea of the myth itself. And that's the power of myth. I've thought about this a lot lately, even in things of like, going back to Greek mythology or whatever it may be, how many things we're able to explain because we started with myth.
Right.
And in science, yes, fills in the rest of the picture, but this is another example. It's the idea that I'm multitasking, I'm doing multiple things. Now you're switching very efficiently in between tasks. So, but modern science has been able to give us that answer, but it shows you how to explore the unknown. We start out with this, story, so to speak. Anyway, I just thought that.
Yeah, it's great. Thanks.
Just a quick comment to Jenny about, and it's really kind of almost a joke. One day some guy ran into a millipede and says, "Oh my God, like how in the hell can you walk? You got so many legs. How do you coordinate it?" And so the millipede is starting to explain, and suddenly it came to a screeching halt because when he thought about it, he didn't know how, and then he just sort of froze, like there was no way for him to walk anymore because he's thinking too hard about it.
Yeah.
I just want to point that out. That was
that's your conscious
joke.
brain. That system too. Yeah.
Right. So sometimes, it's just that's these mysterious things that you better not, in a way, try to figure it out too much, at least while you're doing it, because like you're going to come to a frozen stand and, the lion's going to eat you up.
Yes. That example is so relevant to this essay. There's something implied in this first paragraph that we were just talking about in 7.3. And that is, the miser may be cruel in most of his life when he's being conscious, because that's the program he set for himself. But in the part of the week where he becomes unconscious, or rather where he relies upon begriff and his unchosen early training, he's a good person. He actually gives, and his generosity will help people in the world. And it is because that is the unexamined part of his life that he's able to be good in it. If he was, and this is something Kenneth sort of hints at in the paragraphs that follow, but never fully explicates, but I know he means it, that this goes back to the discussion of Kant. And what does it do if you purge all of the irrational, unconscious, subjectivist, emotionalist, traditionalist parts from your morality and try to be strictly, consciously, analytically ethical? He says, 9 times out of 10, you're going to become a worse person. And part of the reason you become a worse person is because a lot of that unconscious stuff is the result of generations and generations and generations of cultural evolution. The cultures that actually survived were the ones that didn't all kill and eat each other, and that had some basis for helping each other, so that could be the foundation upon which people could pursue their various aims. And if you pull that foundation out from under, all you're left with is dog eat dog, and we all tear each other to pieces. And so there is this sense in which and that's just one way to put it. There's a less political, kind of more philosophical way to put it, which is that human beings, Homo sapiens, has existed for a couple 100,000 years maybe, and we don't know how we made it through that time because there's no record. We don't know why we survived. We don't know why we weren't just a short-lived experiment that went poof. But there's conclusions that can be drawn from the fact that we did survive that long. And one of the conclusions is that we must have got enough things right for however we did it. We must have got enough things right that we weren't able to do ourselves in so quickly. There is a certain, in that unconscious, unexamined, hidden, ahistorical body of culture that has come down to us, there is a certain survival value, a certain irreducible survival value that's proven by the fact that we can be here questioning it at all today, right? If it was wholly maladaptive, we wouldn't be here to ask these questions. So some of those things that culture somehow figured out to do right were things that people consciously thought about, because we know we're conscious thinkers and we consciously think about some things. So you can just guess that a certain amount of that culture was come up with. But looking around, you can also see there's an enormous bonus of unconscious behavior and unconscious convergence on things in human behavior that would also have been a factor in the creation of these relatively adaptive cultures. So it means that a certain amount of the things that work, that make it possible for us to survive and keep going, are things that we might not have been able to conclude rationally. They might not make sense within our systems of thinking. They can be right, but also seem wrong to us at the same time. And as long as we go on doing those things, then we're complying with evolution's mandate, which is I rewarded you with survival because you did these things, even if you didn't know why you did them. But if you then consciously analyze them and say, I can't see any reason to do that, I'm going to stop doing it, then your ego has now gained conscious control over that part of your culture at the cost of, your survival. Now the culture collapses and that's the end of your culture, because you couldn't see the reasons why that was an important thing to do, but you wanted to be in charge and you thought it was more important to be conscious than to do the right thing. You thought it wasn't possible to do the right thing without being conscious. This is a Kantian proposition for why you should do ethics instead of morality, but that proposition is based on the premise that we don't have 200,000 years of unconscious survival that predates it, which proves it's not the case that everything has to be consciously considered in order to be the right thing to do. So it means you have to be very careful with rocking certain boats, and Kantianism is a radical agenda that says you should question everything. It takes Socrates' dictum that the unexamined life is not worth living for a human being and says, so therefore let's not do that. Let's examine everything and we'll decide and we'll throw out all the bad things. Just like at the French Revolution, they invented the metric system, they changed the days of the week, their calendar, they changed everything because they didn't want there to be anything unconscious. But some of the things that they consciously decided to do were horrible. You're right. The ego can't be trusted just because it's in charge and wants to be in charge. And this is a theme throughout this entire essay. And what we see with this example in the opening paragraph is a guy who, there's probably a lot of things he does right in his day-to-day life, but he does some things wrong because he's consciously chosen to be that way. And if he could purify himself and bring himself entirely under conscious control, he'd be an ethically worse human being. And this flies in the face of the Socratic dictum that the unexamined life is not worth living. This is a contradiction that goes right to the heart of the human condition that even most philosophers don't ever really want to grapple with, because we're an ultra Apollonian culture who believes everything is better if you examine it. And the idea that we might not be qualified to examine certain things and yet think that we are, and that if we are given authority over those things, we will make them much, much worse. This is unthinkable to us because we've been seduced by Verstand and the ego into thinking everything is better merely for being blessed by the ego and its Verstand processes. So I'm bringing this up because I just love the fact that Kenneth goes right at this deep critique of reason right in the opening paragraph of 7.3. He does it in a subtle way. He does it by example, but he's doing it on purpose. It's the whole topic here. So, oh my God, so many hands, and I have no idea what order. Sharon, did you get the order?
Donald? It's Donald, then me, then
I think
Joseph,
Stephen
then
is around.
I think it's Mary Ann, Donald, Sharon.
Marianne doesn't have her hand up.
Oh, she
No,
does.
Stephen
my
is
hand
around.
up.
I've been having his hand up for a long time.
No,
Thank you.
Donald's hand. Donald is the one to go first. I'm
Okay,
I'm
okay, all
observing.
right. No.
Okay. Go ahead, Donald.
Well, first to Joseph, I think in modern thought, there's clearly a big inversion that I see because of my own field, kind of a pernicious myth that the brain is a computer running a program. It's what AI is all about. And therefore we talk about things like multitasking because they're a clear property of operating systems, dispatching algorithms and stuff like that. They don't evolve out of studying the phenomena of mental events or anything like that. They come because there's this sort of part of applied mathematics that we clearly understand and is very deterministic, and we can do it. So there are some philosophers, John Searle is one I read sometimes. He's not like Kenneth, but he's pretty knowledgeable about computers and AI and stuff like that, and makes the case that natural intelligence and artificial intelligence kind of have a word in common. They don't really have much more than that, but he knocks down a lot of the AI arguments that are fairly silly. And to Rick, in capitalist America, it's dog eat dog. In Soviet Russia, it's just the opposite.
I totally love that quote.
Dog.
So, all right. Go on to Mary Ann, please.
Thank you, Donald. Go ahead, Marianne.
I wanted to talk about an experience I had in South Pasadena. I walked by the library and there were many old souls that were doing Tai Chi. And I felt like they had entered into a dance with infinity. They had opened some kind of door. And I think the Western culture, because of our association with good and evil and being good or bad, the shame culture and the religiosity that evolves around the shame culture, and some religions are the cop-out culture that they don't even try for ethics, that we really, like what Joseph said, the power of myth, like what, in order to be good, I think that Rick is right, that we have to go into that subconscious and get that sense of integrity where our spirit and our soul line up together, and we know that this is right and this is wrong, rather than the peer pressure. And so I believe that some cultures, the Taoist culture, had a really profound thing of taking this out of good and bad and making it into a dynamic that you can balance and recorrect yourself.
Thank you, Marianne. Yeah, there's a the Vernunft, which Hegel says we should be striving for as the adult mode of thought, requires both gnosis and noesis. If we find that our life leads us in directions that are too analytical, too intellectual, and too rational, we have to correct. We have to find ways to expose ourselves to experiences that can overwhelm our ego, at least temporarily, and remind us that there is this other dimension of thinking and experiencing that can put us in touch with things that are important, but that we don't understand and may not even be able to speak clearly about. And so, on Facebook, I write a certain number of analytical essays, but a lot of what I do is I share art, and I share photos of complex, interesting phenomena from nature, like uncoiling ferns, or high resolution waterfall pictures where you can see lots of droplets and the splash patterns. I'm always looking for things that'll sort of shock the intellectual brain out of being in charge and give us a chance for a moment to experience things again in a way that's moving enough to remind us that those parts of our brain, we need them in order to be whole human beings. We need gnosis to be functioning well, and to plug us into the whole of things, and to help us to question the certainties that over intellectualization encourages us, unfortunately, to seduce us into. It's like that thing that Kenneth says, it's like Verstand, Noesis, it makes a great servant. It just makes a terrible master. And so we have to constantly remind ourselves to not let it be in charge, and that there are other things that are important that it needs to play nicely with. And that's part of why I do traditional Okinawan martial arts, is the experience, the body wisdom, the experience of going through the forms and being so focused on how am I moving, and am I moving the right way, and how does it feel? It just drives away a lot of the intellectual clutter and kind of puts my feet back under me again. And I think especially as moderns, we have to sort of consciously do things in our lives as antidotes, as to balance ourselves back out. Who's next, Sharon?
I think I'm next. Then
Okay.
it's Joseph. Then I'm next. Joseph, Stephen, Phil.
Okay, go ahead.
All right. So I just wanted to make a comment about the brain. The brain, in my experience, is a work in progress, and it will be a work in progress for a long, long time. And one of the observations that I have made about the brain is that you learn more from malfunction than from normal function.
Yes.
Right? So you get a stroke, and there's a function that always amazes me. Some people get a stroke and they're able to speak. They don't have any paresis, but they lose things like putting their hands in the pocket and be able to identify a quarter. That's a very subtle thing. Now, what part of the brain is that? And you have to miss it to know that it's there. So when Ginny's doing her exercises with her hands and her brain, it's part of the memory and muscle function and part of the major integration of that brain. It's a fascinating place to be. And the other thing I wanted to say is we're talking about Kenneth Smith and the miser and his different motives. And I thought I like this sentence here where I think he summarizes it. It's in the third paragraph. He says, when we analyze or diagnose or psychoanalyze people's motives, for example, in politics or in reading a mystery novel or decoding some everyday remark, we're trying to puzzle out not just the tangle of emotions or interests that lie all in the same plane, something you said, Rick, but also the priority or hierarchy of different species of motive and interest, i.e., what element of or orgasmic subsystem in his psyche ultimately benefited from his behavior or his ploy. And that's the Begriff, Verstand, and all the stuff you're talking about. Differently put, the contents of experience and self-expression differ from one another, not just qualitatively, but ordinally in terms of their ranking or determinative power over one another.
Yes.
And I thought that was pretty profound. And I thought that kind of summarized what you're saying in the different character types of the Greeks that we're studying, of Hegel that we're studying.
Yeah, I agree. That's a great couple of sentences there, and it 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 definitely, it's possible sometimes with Kenneth Smith because he's running around collecting all these different ideas and pulling them together to lose track of the fact that he's on a topic. But clearly, what you've just quoted is an explication of his opening paragraph in this. This is just like you say. This is where he's saying, why can this person do these things that they do, and be comfortable with it? And it's because, as you quoted here, there's priority among these different layers of the basal metabolism of the mind. Some things override other things, and they're very good at it and smooth at it, so that to the human being it feels like an experiential whole of being yourself and thinking your thoughts. And you don't notice the conflicts underlying that went into deciding what would be my next thought. Like it's like you don't notice your heartbeat unless your heart's pounding. In the same way, you don't notice the way your brain is smoothly switching between these priorities depending on who's got the juice. And it feels like you're just having a reasonable line of thought. So you can see this as well when people critique arguments to see how logical or rational they are. Frequently what you discover is that what on the surface seemed like a logical, rational argument actually has one or more jumps in it, where the brain went to something with more juice and did it in a way that would, let's say, on casual inspection, satisfy the rational side of the brain. But on deeper inspection, you realize what actually happened is that you did a jump. You did a leap. And that's because your brain realized that it was better over there thinking those thoughts than it was over here thinking these thoughts. It's like it's always chasing the juice. So
I also like how he segues into the characteristics of the soul in the next paragraph.
Yes. Well, this is the whole thing, right? This is the payoff. This is where he's really getting into the structure of how it works. But let's come back to that. I want to call on the other guys first, and then let's come back.
Stephen's turn.
Sharon, could you just take a look at the chat, Sharon, real quick? Thank you.
Oh yeah, I was just wondering, one of the huge struggles in my life, and I suppose a lot of people's life, is with the humanist rationalist tradition, with its apparently grand ethical project.
Right.
I mean, this is the revolutionary ethical project. They usually say they're atheists, so they've overthrown our former master, St. Paul.
Right.
So that's quite a leap. So I was just wondering, this has been, you sort of get this with Nietzsche a bit, where what's this audacity with the rationalists? Like, what makes you think that you've got the goods on what would say humanity should be, or something like that? And
yes.
I mean, the religious, they've got a good argument, even if it's false, that there's this huge all-powerful being in the universe which is greater than me, which has directed me to have a certain set of values. Whether that's true or not doesn't matter, but it's a pretty good argument. But the rationalists, humanists come along, dismiss that God, and they say we can know what is perfectly ethical, and we can proceed and order civilization to follow that path.
Right.
And what has struck me is what you've said, that really in the fate of civilizations and cultures, it doesn't seem that the conscious preoccupation with morality does it really work. It seems to be that the good cultures arise out of the darkness, and the bright cultures, even though they say they're moral and ethical, descend into the darkness. So what would you have to say about that?
I'd say you're right on the nose. I mean, that's it, right? This is what Nietzsche and Smith and other existentialist philosophers are critiquing about modernism, is that modernism rationalizes its own existence by comparing rationalism at its best to medievalism at its worst. right? It's Luther nailing the 96 Theses to the church, saying, hey, medieval culture, you are in the middle of the most obvious corruption and hypocrisy you ever did, and you're doing it now. And I will choose this moment to stand up and say, there's a whole other way to do this, and everything about you is wrong, and everything about me is good. And off launches modernism, right? Which doesn't fully explain itself because it's using the power of a bad example to sort of hide its own issues. It's scapegoating things.
You're referring to the hubris of modernism.
Yes.
Yeah, I struggle with this one when I talk with a lot of people. It's like, you're talking history. They talk about the Middle Ages and they say, how wonderful we are and how progressed are we on the Middle Ages. And I'm thinking, oh, shit, you have to get in a time machine, go back to ancient Rome and the Middle Ages. Hey, you guys, you screwed up. It's not even worth living. We're going to release cyanide gas all over the planet, so you're suffering. So you're living without Karl Marx.
Right.
I'm just amazed at how quickly people fall into this idea that we're absolutely superior on some sort of... Is there actually a universal cosmic scale printed in the right. Cosmic ethers somewhere that says, oh, we've climbed the ladder over these guys in the past?
Right. Yeah, there's this great march of progress that modernism assumes to exist, and that because modernism comes after medievalism, it ipso facto must be superior and more advanced, right? And that irrational bit of reasoning is surprisingly everywhere when you read modernist descriptions of history. There's this built-in programming that we don't even think about when we're thinking, where we just take for granted that of course the later thing is better than the earlier thing. And when we do a revolution like the one that we did, that modernism did to break away from medievalism, in the same way, it again says, now that we're not medievals, everything is better, right? Everything is better. And it encourages this failure to analyze our own problems, because we can always say, well, at least we're not medievals. What do you want? You want to go back to being medieval? Well, then shut up. Then this is the best, right? There's this, and you see these arguments when people talk about politics or economics or history or anything else. There's this kind of scapegoating, but Johnny broke the vase, so you can't yell at me kind of level of toddler reasoning that underlies an enormous number of what otherwise look like adult conversations on the subjects of history and so forth. So I'm with you, Stephen. It's a huge thing. And it's what's interesting.
It's the apparent pushing of, your Verstand as a god.
Exactly. Yeah, Kenneth likes to point us at Pico della Mirandola, who's an essayist who wrote the Oration on the Dignity of Man, as being one of the cleanest, purest summations of modernism in a nutshell, because it is so full of admiration for the human intellect and human decision-making that it's standing up against the corruption of the past and how all the bad things can now be pushed into the past and blamed on them, and everything good, we will say, arises because of the brilliance of our dignified, fabulous reason that is, as we know, perfect and can't possibly lead us into terrible catastrophes.
Okay, Piccolo, did you say?
Pico della Mirandola. Let me pull up the name.
Okay.
It's not long. It's easy enough to read. Here it is. So this is the guy, and here's a reference to his essay. Kenneth cites him all the time. When we eventually do our one on millennia and microcosm, when we talk about the epochs, probably next year, you'll see that when we get to modernism, he barely starts the chapter on modernism before he points you at Mirandola. Because Mirandola was so early in the process of modernism that he didn't know how to cover up the ego of modernism. They were still too excited and proud and revolutionary. So he just came out and said all kinds of things that the rest of us are all thinking all the time, but we would never say it that way because it doesn't sound so good if you just flat out say some of the assumptions of modernism, they don't hold together quite as well. It's better if we're thinking them unconsciously, because then we will never examine them. We'll never be confronted with, but is that really true? Are we really the top of the pyramid? Are we could there be nothing in the past to learn from? Is that really how it all works? If you say it out loud, you start to ask these questions. But as long as we don't say it and we just feel it and are taught it in school, and as long as it's reinforced in newspaper articles and movies and TV shows, then we can go on complying with it without ever realizing that it doesn't actually make sense as a premise for a civilization. So, there's this thing that Kenneth talks about sometimes that's really related to what you brought up. He talks about Christianity and how different is modernist Christianity from medievalist Christianity, and how different is medievalist Christianity from the initial Christianity that arose during the ancient epoch. And he says part of the reason why that's true is just the usual rise and fall of civilizations. But part of it is that the original Christians were Christians in response to the ancient cultures. They had been raised in all those cultures. They knew all those assumptions. They knew their audience knew all those assumptions. They took it all for granted. And so they never bothered to spell out a bunch of the basal framework of what made early Christianity work. They assumed, of course, you would get all that automatically, and therefore they could focus on their critiques and what they wanted to do differently. But as time passed and people got further and further away from that initial break, the preconditions for somebody to be an early Christian fell away. The classical education fell away. The mythology fell away. And now Christianity was standing on its own 2 feet and not part of a larger system, which was what it was designed to be originally. And when it lost the larger system, it basically became a different religion. And the same thing happened again with the modernist revolution. When we peeled away medievalism and said, well, now Christianity is going to be strictly rational and it's going to serve modernist civilization. Again, a whole bunch of what made Christianity was jettisoned, along with the corruption and the bad things that Luther and others were revolting against. We also threw out a whole bunch of the good stuff that had managed to survive from the early epoch. And what we're left with today, I think both Nietzsche and Smith argue, well, and Kierkegaard argued, this isn't Christianity anymore. We can call it the same thing, but it is a grandchild of Christianity that has gone through just amazing changes. It's got some of the surface rituals and a lot of the words and some of the patterns, but the meaning of it is totally different now than it was.
This is the problem of history when, say, Christianity is dismissed as nonsense. Right. But I have to argue that the nonsense was enormously successful for 2,000 years almost.
Right.
Explain that to me, but they're not interested.
Exactly. This is what's running throughout this whole essay, that there is a cargo, an enormous cargo of unexamined culture and history that is essential for our survival. Because if we had to figure out everything from scratch and rationally come to the conclusions, we would screw up an enormous amount of it. When Socrates says the unexamined life is not worth living for a man, which I first heard, in high school in my adolescence, and I fell in love with that statement, and I wanted to be that guy. That's what made me want to be a philosopher. I wanted to live the examined life. But at that point in my education in philosophy, I was just not prepared to understand what Socrates meant. And a Smithian critique of Socrates is that if we all did what Socrates seems to be saying, we would destroy civilization. And that's why the Athenians killed him. The rise of the sophists was a direct consequence of this idea that everything should be decidable and rational and argued out, and that nothing should have any respect anymore. There should be no momentum to carry us through the difficulties of history. We should jettison everything and start from scratch every generation. It doesn't actually work for human civilization. It's not how we made it through 200,000 years of Homo sapiens evolving. But, so what it means is that the Socratic proposition is closely related to the modernist proposition. The idea that we can just chuck the past and start over and think our way to a solution. Kenneth Smith compares this to, you sometimes see these medieval fairy tales that involve clever Hans or Jack or some figure who's a fool, but he asks the questions and thinks his way to the answers without needing to know anything about the world. He can out clever the elf king. He can out clever all the sophisticated people and think his way to a solution. Kenneth says, when you pare away all the rationalist dogma, that is the myth of modernism. The belief that we don't need history, we don't need culture, we don't need tradition. We'll just make it up as we go along and somehow it will all work out. And of course, that's not actually how life works. I mean, Sharon works as an anesthesiologist, you know, how well would it work to grab some random, completely untrained, but very, very smart person and put them in charge of an anesthesiology department and say, here, you decide how we'll do anesthesia. Well, a lot of people would die, right? Because there's just no substitute for that huge bonus of unconscious education and culture that has built up in anesthesiology over the decades. You can't think your way to success by being clever. And that's where modernism gets into trouble. So I'm glad you brought it up, Stephen. I mean, ultimately, you put your finger right on the underlying critique that Kenneth has of modernism, which is it thinks it's the hottest thing since sliced bread. And that's its problem. And at this point, I've lost track of who goes next. So Sharon, oh, you're on mute, Sharon.
Phil, I think Phil and me.
Okay.
Go ahead, first.
My thought comes along with this, but at a slightly different angle. For some reason, systems always, in some way, degenerate into a struggle for power, and so that's interesting itself. And I want to bring up AlphaGo. I was on AlphaGo meeting. How AlphaGo is related to Neo-Confucianism, I think yesterday. And most of the people didn't get the point that I was trying to make. They thought, well, you know, the threat of the computer and all that, and that might be a threat. I'm not denying that might be a threat, but that was not the point I was making. I have said in this meeting before that the most interesting and important game was the fifth game. But I need the fourth game to set that up. Well, AlphaGo beat the world champion the first three games. And the world champion, everybody thought he was going to win. You know, a computer can't possibly beat it. But it beat him the first three games. And for some reason, the champion was able to make a move that transcended even AlphaGo, who seemed to have much more computational power, seemed to know the rules of Go much better in a way, okay? So it won because everybody said, wow, that's a kind of incredible, they call it the God move, okay? So that was interesting. So on the fifth game, what happened was AlphaGo realized as they play the game that in a sense, the only thing that was going to prevent it from winning was the world champion is going to make another God move, which is sort of outside of its understanding of how it's played. So it decided to switch the game and play a power game, forcing the champion to respond to what it was doing. So therefore, it never had a chance to make the God move, the genius, artistic move, whatever you want to call it, right? Yeah. Because it know that if it stuck to the system itself, it will eventually win.
Yes.
So it is interesting how that comment to me showed me that when the system is powerful enough, even if you know that you have the God move, it could force you to play the system move because you have to survive till the next move and the next move and the next move and the next move. And eventually, when you count the beads or whatever it is, it wins,
yeah.
And that's all at once. It doesn't need to win by 300, just one or two, that's good enough. So I think the problem with society now is that I think this is the I think it's a special moment. It might be not so special after all in a transitional period. It might be a special moment because the system has become so powerful that you have to play the game
Yes.
in order to survive till the next day,
Yes.
right? If you think that you're so clever, you're going to end up being Texas Ginsey in the mountains of Montana
Yes.
against the system, and that ain't gonna work
Right.
because they've sent the forces after you, all sorts of ways to do it. Eventually, they're gonna nab you. So in a sense, we are in such a stranglehold of the system, a multidimensional, World Monetary Fund, systematic racism, and all. I mean, all that stuff. It's so bred in that it's virtually impossible to work against it. Perhaps the only thing that could work is a revolution, and we don't want to destroy everything also as a result. So that to me is already happening in the Congress, like, oh no, like democracy is going to go down the tube because the other side is not going to play the game that we play. They're playing a different game, like Joe Manchin, please understand this. We're in a very desperate moment that AlphaGo is forcing us to play, that we need to break out of that understanding and make the God move, if you want to call it that way. So I think the warning is to always pay attention to the system, particularly when it's become so entrenched and so powerful that it's virtually impossible for you to move outside, because let's see how well you do living off the streets of Los Angeles.
Yes. Every time you say that story, it becomes more relevant in my mind. I keep thinking through the analogies to kind of Kenneth Smith's core philosophy. When we finish Mythos and Logos, we're in the last chapter now. The next book of his we're going to go through that we agreed we would do is Human Natures, which is his one on human character types and how they relate to modes of thought and culture. And one of the things that he says in there is that another one of the characteristics of the modern epoch is an unprecedented hostility to Vernunft and to the development of Aristoi, because Aristoi questioned the system. It is the whole reason to engage in Vernunft is to think outside the flatlands of Begriff and Verstand and be able to critique them and say, well, what should we change in order to avoid catastrophes in the future? And the system doesn't want to be changed. It sees that as disruption. The healing and evolution that it needs in order to become a sustainable system, it sees as a threat that endangers vested interests. Wherever we have investments, we don't want things to change or else we lose money. So, the more money we have, the more we can ossify the system and keep it from growing, keep it from adapting. And in order to make that work, you have to make sure there aren't any Aristoi. There's nobody who has the spare time or the cultural upbringing to be able to engage in Vernunft a significant part of their life. And so effectively, modernism is being AlphaGo and is doing exactly what you said and ruling out those God moves that would make us question things.
I'm exiling all the philosophers from the city of Rome.
Say that again?
I'm exiling all the philosophers from the city of Rome.
Yes.
Domitian, I think it was.
Yes, exactly. Or like the way that Plato wanted to get rid of artists in the Republic, because they might mock the things that matter. This sense of there will be no transcending, there will be no overcoming. You must work within the system. And of course, what all systems like that fail to understand about themselves is the astonishing hubris of thinking your system could be perfect enough to never need to change. The hubris. I write software for a living. You can hardly write 3 lines of code without putting a bug in there somewhere. It's like the moment you start making things, you start introducing problems. This is very close to Gödel's theorem. And the more complex the system is, the more of a great world machine it becomes, the more problems it has and the bigger the scale of the problems. You desperately need people who are working on critiquing the system and saying, well, what should we change? Even if it challenges vested interests, But as long as vested interests are in charge, they'll make sure that that doesn't happen, and you get the alpha ghost syndrome going on.
Well, that's also in the individual, though. The individual can make a huge emotional investment.
Yes.
In various life avenues.
Yes, that's right. That's right. It manifests not just at the big, civilization-wide scale, but you're right, Stephen, right down to the individual scale. We have our perverse incentives and vested interests where we don't want certain things to be changed. Kenneth calls this characterological genocide. He says this is the first epoch in history in which there's no role for Aristoi, and they are suppressed. Their development is suppressed. Anybody who might otherwise have developed into an Aristos is bent back into being a doulos or a benausos. They're constrained to use Begriff and Verstand, and they're punished if they attempt to use Vernunft. Vernunft, they want to think outside. Vernunft wants to infinitize. It wants to think outside the box. It wants to find new ways to see the world and then change our behavior to take advantage of those new insights. And that's exactly where you get hemmed in by all the bills you have to pay, and by the busier and busier and busier schedules, that don't leave you time to do anything else. I was looking at something about how the price of a college education has changed. It's more than 10 times as expensive in real dollars than it was when I was little. When I was young, I could myself pay for college just by working part-time. And now people can't pay for college even for the rest of their lives. They go into debt and they stay in debt forever. They become debt slaves.
I wish to counter that a little bit, sorry, but I'm a big student of monetarism. And I would say the college fees have remained the same. What's happened is the wages, the income of ordinary people has gone. In real terms.
Sure. That would have the same effect.
So the prices, the grand prices are similar.
Yeah.
But what the ordinary average Joe's earning is way down on what was there in 1970.
Right. Good point, Stephen. Thank you. And you can see this as well in the relationship between the prices of houses and how much income people have. The ability to buy a house is going down. You can see this. You can also see this not just in personal life, but in professional life. Those of us who have been involved with standards committees and with user communities in the software world, an enormous number of them died over the last 30 years. When I was starting out my career, it was normal to go multiple times a year to different kinds of professional associations, to go to conferences and get together with people from all over your industry and compare notes and make plans and set standards and so forth. But increasingly, these things have moved online, not because it's cooler and better, but because nobody can afford all that time off from work, because now you have to work all the time in order to make ends meet. Whereas before you would only have to work sometimes to make ends meet, and you had some time left over to be creative and think about strategy and the big picture and community building and so forth. So you can see over and over in lots of industries, the ways in which the scope of freedom of choice is shrinking decade by decade. You can see it in the way a lot of newspapers now don't have their own photographers. They just outsource it. Or they go to photography businesses and buy things out of there. They can't afford it anymore. You can see it in the way enormous numbers of newspapers don't have full-time editors anymore. They can't afford editing. They've been cutting and cutting and cutting back the meat of their business to try to be able to make ends meet until they're able to do less and less and sort of barely squeak by. And it's creating a crisis. But we all feel it in our personal lives, but characterologically, culturally, it's squeezing out any possibility of Vernunft or of anybody developing into an Aristos, because nobody's going to have that kind of free time to be able to focus on these questions. And you don't have to say it's by design. It's not necessarily by conspiracy. It's more by convergence. It's the pressures working themselves out to align into a streamlined form that is purifying itself, becoming a more better version of what it started out as. Better. It's doubling down on its cultural strategy is what's happening.
So the long history of the Roman Empire was closing down the symposiums.
Right.
It's like the Ptolemaic ruler of Egypt who decided, shit, what they're doing in the Library of Alexandria, they're against me.
Right.
Get rid of those guys.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So, where are we going? Where are we going to end up with this? This was a curious thing that when Rome fell in 410 AD, over in Constantinople, they actually decided to reopen the symposiums.
Yes.
Even with having some pagans there, which was a horrifying thought. But for a brief moment, they were trying to open up. Shit, Rome's fallen, the glorious city.
Yes.
We must be doing something wrong.
Yes.
We might have to open up the symposiums again and question what's going on. And that went on until Justinian finally closed down the academies again a century later.
You know, what you're saying, you can see it. I don't know if anybody's read Cicero here, but if you study the history of theory on virtues and vices, if you're studying axiology and you start in the medieval period and look at what they thought the virtues and vices were, and then trace your way back to the ancient epoch, to what did, Plato think the virtues and vices were? What did Aristotle think they were? And so forth. You'll find them among the Romans, one of the most important writers on this subject is Cicero, who wrote a book called De Officiis, in which he is responding to the Greek conception of the virtues and vices and putting together his own schema, which then became the core schema for the next 1,000 years. Everybody, all the medieval people who are writing about axiology refer back to Cicero's De Officiis. It's this hugely important book. But in the introduction to De Officiis, Cicero apologizes for wasting people's time by talking about philosophy. He says, now I know thinking is bad unless it leads directly to practical action. But I assure you, this will lead you directly to practical action. Trust me, it's worth. I'm not doing an evil, horrible, un-Roman thing by daring to spend some time thinking. I swear this is practically useful, and it really shows the mindset of the Roman Empire. Just like what you said, Stephen, at that period, that way that he felt like it was this dangerous, audacious thing he was doing, and he had to mind himself and describe himself as being strictly practical so that he too wouldn't get purged. And of course, as I recall, things didn't end well for Cicero later on for other reasons. So, being a philosopher was a dangerous business during those parts of the Roman.
Or Cicero was Roman, whereas Socrates was Greek, right?
Right. Okay. Yeah, Socrates was Athenian. So, all right, let's. Who's next on our lists? Sharon, do you remember?
I think I'm next, and
Okay.
then Donald and Marianne.
Okay, go ahead, Joseph.
Well, one, I want to thank Phil for that story because the AlphaGo story, because it actually does resonate more and more each time that I see the relevance of it in the sense that the system actually, if the system can force what you do, then a completely rationalist perspective is automatically by default going to be wrong. It's going to be an incorrect starting spot because their premise will be perverted essentially by the system itself. So understanding that with the terms of AlphaGo actually gives me another perspective of it. It's a really great metaphor that works. But one of the things that I often thought about is, and I notice this too with people, and in a way it kind of deals with the second paragraph on 98, but a little bit, but it just the sense that sometimes we make the wrong decisions to get to the right place. And that's an important concept to understand, because if we do that, and if you have a totally like a modernist approach where you throw things out, like you have to understand that you may have had the right answer, but you just had the wrong logic underpinning it. So an example of that would be something like maybe sometimes what Christianity was. Maybe there was something to what they were saying as their process, but the premise, the approach, God, and the power aspect of it was completely wrong. Like, so the ethic maybe aspects of it may be useful, but you don't necessarily just throw out everything. You would keep things like that, or you wouldn't even say Christianity stole things from the Greeks. So, you would keep what the Greeks were essentially saying about things like ethics. So that the idea that you have this what you can keep from traditional type of thinking that allows you to arrive at a certain functional model for the world. That those are the things you keep, but the other things you just change maybe the premise or the logic that was underpinning it in certain cases. Am I thinking about that wrong? Like, is that like a logical way of thinking about it, in the sense of you can have faulty logic but still come up with the right answer?
Yeah.
And throwing out the answer can be problematic. It's more about just replacing the logic than it is replacing the answer.
That's often the case. And when you change the logic, it may change the way you express the truth. It may have a new context or a framework. You see this in software. When you're dealing with complex software systems, you get in these kind of fly-by-night managers who come in and they've been successful elsewhere. And so they think, well, of course they'll be successful here too, right? It must be their own virtues that are why they succeeded and not any other reason. And those virtues travel with them. So now that they're doing something they've never done before, they can again shoot from the hip, tell you what to do, and it'll work because they're so virtuous and smart. So one of the things that you see with this frequently is people come into a complex scenario like medical software and they say, well, let's just rewrite it. Right. And you're like, I can't begin to tell you what a bad idea that is, because none of us remembers anymore all of the thousands and thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of decisions that went into making it the way it is now. Just like decade after decade after decade of user feedback from thousands of people are baked into it the way it is now. And what you want to do is change the things you are certain are broken and leave the rest of it alone.
Right.
And you may change the expression of the code, but you want to keep the code intact because it's full of unconscious wisdom that if you throw that out, you can't begin to imagine how much you're going to lose. And so we talk about that as the difference between rewriting versus refactoring. And in refactoring, you don't change the language, you don't change the container, you don't change most of the contents, you just reword it a little bit to make it clear again. You add annotations, you make it more readable. If you see some bugs, you fix those. But otherwise, the rest of it, you leave it alone because it's carrying with it this burden of unconscious wisdom. And that's the thing we get wrong when we do revolutions, is that typically we check everything. So first of all, out goes the baby along with the bathwater. And second of all, we don't always understand why things were working to begin with in our cultures. In fact, we never really do. So the more aggressively we go at them, the more we damage ourselves going forwards. I'll give you an example of a way in which what you're saying kind of is illustrated. And that is with regard to the idea that the ancients and the medievals shared the idea that people cannot be at the top of the hierarchy of meaning. They just can't be. You have to have something above us, because the human ego, Verstand, is so cancerous that if it thinks it's God, only catastrophe will follow. You have to have something above us. And, the ancients put two things above us. They put nature and the gods. And the medievals got rid of nature. They chucked it to the bottom and said, oh, it's just a creation. But God is above us. But when moderns said, okay, we're going to remove God from being above us, but we're not going to replace it with something else. And instead, we're going to say, how great are humans? How wonderful is the human ego? Well, of course, we were going to get genocide and slavery and world wars, catastrophes, because the ego has been unleashed. He's been put on a pedestal, and we've all said, we will feed you anything you want.
And Nietzsche warned us of that. Essentially, and even Kierkegaard, the understanding of, well, I won't go into it, but go ahead.
I'm sorry. Medievals warned us, right? And the ancients warned us. Everybody warned us about the problem of human ego. But, you know, we were too full of ourselves because we were throwing out corruption. And so we're
Right.
like, you know, if throwing out corruption requires removing the church from being in charge of everything, we'll just do it and consider that that must have solved all the problems, right? What else could there be? And especially whenever you start to appeal to the ego and to Verstand, any argument that says what could possibly go wrong? Surely we've accounted for everything. That's what Verstand loves to believe. That is the whole premise of Verstand, that flaw gets infinitized, and the arguments suddenly seem very reasonable. Of course, all we need to do is remove this corrupt thing from on top of us, and everything will be fine. That seems reasonable to me, and I'm a logical, objective person. So let's all do that, and well, here we are. This is where you end up, right? So
yeah, that was a phenomenon of Winston Churchill. I recall historically, Winston Churchill in the 1930s, 1920s was dismissed as a troglodyte, and he obviously had faults. You know, you're the grave of humanity, Churchill. You know, die and go away, because everybody objected to his views. When Hitler came along, they fell to pieces, all these superior people. And old Winston, well, you know, that was the irony. The guy who'd been dismissed as the hangover from the past,
right,
was the guy that was standing up against Hitler when the rest of them had fled.
Right. Good point, Stephen. Thank you. So, who's next? Donald, are you next?
Donald.
Go ahead, Donald.
Yes. Considering what you said, Rick, it just makes me wonder why so many modern political movements want to call themselves progressive.
Yes.
Because progress is very elusive. It's not easily done.
It's the journey.
It's a journey. And a lot of this discussion here has made me think of a book that it's still cited all the time. In fact, I think it's cited more now than it was. Richard Hofstadter, Anti-Intellectualism in American Life, where he takes on the sort of political right. You know, it's used now as a hammer to hit the political right because it takes on a lot of things that were really bad. You know, what he calls anti-intellectualism. But nobody reads it now to see what he defended. Right. And what he defended was progress and how much better we are and how we can get rid of all this, you know, sort of stuff. But that's not its use. But when you read it that way, I don't know where you're left, because he's saying, well, we've got these anti-intellectuals that go to their fundamentalist churches and believe all this nonsense, but by golly, we've got, you know, false models of the mind, false models of human behavior. You know, we've got all the blessings of Verstand, you know.
What more could you need?
Yeah, right.
We all just purify ourselves. I mean, strictly Verstand.
I just, whenever I see it cited, and you see it sort of always cited now by sort of leftist political stuff, because it really hit the cultural right, I guess is what we call it now, but formerly the Middle America, or as Macon called it, the bourgeoisie or something. But I don't know. We're now, like you say, we're interested in throwing away.
We are.
Good. Yes. I hope the first thing is the guillotines are all gone, because you know, yeah. Enough.
Yeah, there was a movement in the 60s and 70s, maybe inspired by Star Trek, but really more deeply inspired by this notion of progress, to erase the past. And like in Seattle, we had
Sounds Orwellian.
It does, doesn't it? It was the belief that the past is bad, the future is good, and so the sooner we erase the past and replace it with shiny new things, the better we'll all be. And I live a few blocks from Green Lake in North Seattle, and on Green Lake is this little section of what was once a giant amphitheater that stuck out into the lake and had a stage on the lake. And in the early 20th century, they did aquafollies and shows out there where people would get together from around the city, and they'd show their talent to each other and do stuff. And later it became a concert venue. Led Zeppelin played there in the 70s. But it was seen as old, and television was seen as the new thing. So in the 70s, they were going to tear the whole thing down. And there was just one guy associated with the city council who's like, I think this is such a bad idea, because this was such an important part of our history, and because communities coming together physically and doing things together and not just sitting in their own homes looking at their television sets. I think your love of TVs is taking us the wrong way. Can you at least preserve some tiny slice of the amphitheater and put up some signs to say what used to be there? And they reluctantly agreed. They thought it was a horrible waste of money not to kill the whole thing, but they reluctantly agreed. If they didn't do that, we'd have had no idea that ever existed. That whole part of our history would be erased. And of course, today, we're all well too aware of the problem of everybody sitting in their own houses, looking at their own TVs and never interacting like neighbors with each other. The guy was right, but he was fighting against a tide of modernism and progressivism that said we must erase the past at all costs. I had another friend, when I went to Walla Walla in high school, and I had another friend who wanted to be a vet, but it's very hard to get into vet school in the US. Veterinary medicine is as complicated a thing to get into in many ways as human medicine. So she ended up going to Great Britain and going to England and Shropshire and becoming a vet there, because they're always looking for vets who want to work with animals. They've got such a rural tradition. And she said that in the 1980s and early 90s, Britain was exactly the same way that the US was in the 70s. They couldn't wait to erase their past. They were running around, modernizing everything, stripping everything down, and obviously they couldn't get rid of things like Stonehenge, but anything that was in between was fair game to be just bulldozed over and erased, as though it had no significance and that the past didn't matter. And so this kind of mania.
I can kind of understand all the destructive bombing that went on during World War I and II, and how depressing that may be to live right next to all that kind of destruction. So I can kind of understand that, thinking based, right?
Yeah.
But in other ways, these old architectures, it's a shame that, that's one aspect of old architecture and the art, if you want to see it as architecture as an art. That is a shame.
Well, and there's also this sense of, if we don't know who we were, then we also don't know who we are. And the idea that the past is only a primitive, backwards version of ourselves sets us up to overestimate our own capacities and underestimate kind of what are the lessons that there are still to be learned from people who went before us, who didn't make the mistakes that we're making now. You can see this if you look at certain ways that political science and economics and history are taught, especially in America, where there is this sense that newer is always better and that older is always worse. And that therefore what it means is you don't need to question the present, because by definition it's better than the other choices. It leads to this anti-philosophicalism, this kind of ahistorical approach to the world. After all, it's simpler, right? If we can just ignore the past and focus only on what is and what we're going to do next, doesn't that make everything simpler? And isn't simpler better? You hear this everywhere in modernism. It's part of the catechism of modernism. Newer is better.
I want some. I want to kill the philosopher in me. If these people seem like they're having a good time,
right?
Let's do it, man.
Right? Let's all just blend in. Let's merge.
What is really, really upsetting and sad is Isn't that the Taliban's who are destroying and all these old ancient ruins?
Yeah.
That is really shameful, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, Sharon, who's next?
Let me tell you, I think it's Phil.
Okay, Phil, go ahead.
I need to take exception to this.
Ooh, excellent.
Even though I wouldn't define myself as a progressive. I'm very sympathetic to them. I think it's a matter of being selective. For instance, the environmental movement is a conservative movement. They want to conserve nature, what has been screened out by recent history. So progressivism in many ways is returning to a past that we have silenced. In terms of, let's say, the Native Americans, American Indians, is to, in a sense, return to a degree of past to let their voices be known. That is progressive, and that is also conservative, returning at least to cast off the shadows that, in a sense, modernism or conservatism has cast upon our history by restricting certain voices not to be heard. And so therefore, in a sense, that kind of selective revision of something is important. So therefore, that is also a conservative element within a progressive movement. So you can't just sort of say, well, why you want to be progressive, selectively choosing what is necessary to revive a certain order that has been silenced in order to open up other possibilities, because we know that, in a sense, modern culture also have its way of generating mythology, such as the cowboys and Indians, as an example. I'll give you an example. Recently, just in the past couple of days, I heard about the Carlisle Indians.
Yeah.
And it reminded me immediately of the 1950s movie with Burt Lancaster, with Jim Thorpe, All American. Jim Thorpe, All American. It's a very feel-good story because here is a Native American, an American Indian. He became All American in the sense that he was actually All American in the football in that sense, okay? But they never told us about the graves that was buried in the Carlisle school.
Right.
Okay. So you want to emphasize a certain myth. If you only, in a sense, harmonize with the massive culture, you too could become an all-American. Right. Let's kill the Indian in order to save the man. It was a feel-good story. Well, we know that is a myth, a modern myth, because we know what happened to the Cherokees, right? They wanted to assimilate so badly, like I said, they even had slaves. They traded and they had language and did everything that you wanted. But, you know, like Andrew Jackson wanted to move them out to Oklahoma because the land was necessary for the settlers who wanted that land because it's valuable land. The Cherokees won the court. They were sophisticated enough to go to court, and they argued that case, and the Supreme Court agreed with them. You can't throw these people out because we have a treaty with them. And of course, Andrew Jackson says the Supreme Court had issued their judgment. Let them execute that judgment, right? Instead of following what the Constitution should be, that in a sense, the executive is to execute the opinions of the Supreme Court. Nonetheless, he says, go ahead, you do it, because we know you don't have the power to do it. So this is once again a mythology about a total integration as a solution, because that is in a way a myth to silence the Indian, to kill the Indian in order to save the man. In a sense, that itself is a myth, because there are many more Indians that were killed altogether, let alone saving the man. So don't let the fact that, you know, mythology is always correct. There's certain mythologies such as manifest destiny. I mean, so therefore you got to understand that certain things that modern culture has created a myth to obliterate and silence the history that's been living in the shadows. And that is what the Black Lives Movement's about. We can never understand what they are because we are not them. So let their voices be heard and be sympathetic to them wanting to revive and conserve who they might be, right? Reverend Sharpton said, we don't even need necessarily help. Just get your knee off our necks so we could become who we can be. That seemed like a very reasonable request.
So progress versus progressive versus conservative, you're touching on a critical issue here that Kenneth Smith talks about a lot, and that all of his essays have as a premise, even if they never come out and say it, which is that we have difficulties talking about these things. The more important a term is, the more necessary it is for understanding ourselves in the world, the greater the odds the term's been corrupted to the point that you can't say anymore. You can't make the distinctions you have to be able to make in order to understand what's happening to you or who you are. And an example is progress and progressive. So the term progress is tied up with this 19th century notion that Europe should be in charge of the whole world because we're more advanced. We've progressed further than they have. And everybody else is backwards and therefore deserves to be enslaved or colonized or otherwise dominated. And that great march of progress culminating in the straight white cis intellectual with a lot of money as the pinnacle of evolution is wound throughout the term progress so completely that when you say a word like progressive, you always need help to figure out what you're referring to. Is it that progress? That progress that means let's exterminate a bunch of people and take over their land? Is it progress that means could we all stop being corrupt? What does it mean? And it's the same with conservative. It's like, what do these terms actually mean? How are they being used? The more important the concepts are, the greater the odds the terms are being misused, sometimes on purpose, sometimes unconsciously, because there is enormous value to be had in pulling the wool over people's eyes, enormous value to be had in confusing people about which way is up and what's actually happening in the world. And so, a movement can call itself progressive, whether it is or not. A movement can call itself conservative, whether it is or not. Someone can call themselves a Christian, whether they are or not. What any of these words actually mean becomes harder and harder to tell in this sort of words mean what I say, Alice in Wonderland kind of way. It's a challenge. So I'm glad you brought the issue up because, what's the relationship between progress, progressive, conservation, conservatism? This is just a huge tangle. And it may be clearer to us because of the politics and the way that works when we're talking about political terms, but it's every bit as fraught when we're talking about even such basic terms as to think. What does it mean to think? That is every bit as tangled up as whether something is progressive or conservative. And it affects us at a more fundamental level. Our ability to even conceive of what it is we're doing when we try to engage in this activity is knotted up and bent. We're looking at a funhouse mirror, and we're trying to communicate with each other while all this warpage is going on. And that's why Smith foregrounds the problem of language and talks about it so often. And that's why he uses uncomfortable terms, because these are terms that have not been seized upon by the culture at large and warped to make them useful to somebody in a profitable way. And so there's still a chance to communicate something with a term like Begriff or Verstaat or Vernunft for gnosis or noesis. We could come to understand what we mean when we use them in a way that we really can't when we say the word think or progress. Then we're not sure what we're talking about anymore. Sharon, who's next? Ginny?
I think it's Ginny if she's there. It's Ginny, then Marianne.
Okay, Ginny, go ahead. Oh, you're on mute.
Yes, I thought Marianne was before me, but I just wanted to, I was curious about Cicero going back a few conversations back. So I looked him up and I didn't know he was executed by Antony and
Yes.
Mark Antony. And so I guess he lived from Julius Caesar to Mark Antony, and then Mark Antony just got rid of him, I guess.
Yes.
That was interesting.
I don't know if you ever saw the HBO series Rome.
No, yeah.
It's amazing. If you haven't seen it,
I've heard it's amazing. It's like everybody keeps telling me to watch it. I gotta make time for that.
It's just shocking. Like,
did you say PBS? Which one?
HBO.
HBO. Oh, okay.
The first season is better than the second season. They only had 2 seasons, but they're both really amazing. And one of the things that's in it is Cicero and his execution.
Okay.
It's highly relevant. So yeah, I put a link to Cicero on Wikipedia, and somewhere in here is De Officiis, which there it is.
Yeah, when I read the Shakespeare's play, Julius Caesar, it was when I was in college. I thought, wow. But that really did happen to Caesar, didn't it? I mean,
it did.
Okay.
And the staging of what happened to Julius Caesar that occurs in the HBO series Rome is the best I've ever seen. You fully get the guy, you see where he's coming from, you understand what he was trying to do, but you also understand the hazard that he represents at the same time and why the people did what they did. And yet knowing all sides of it doesn't bring you peace when the event happens. It's even more shocking. Which is a rare thing to do, where the protagonist and the antagonist are both fully in focus, fully sympathetic, fully understandable, and yet what happens is still just, sweet Jesus, this is hard to watch.
Because you had more savages than enlightened people at that point, when you compare the ratio. No, I'm just kidding.
I see what you did there.
Yeah. I mean, let's say Cicero was the enlightened person, and the rest of the people were more savage-like, maybe. Whatever.
All right, Marianne, go ahead.
So I'm reading this book called The Great Influenza, and in it is talking about, one of the quotes was from Faust, and he said that instead of in the beginning was the word, in the beginning was the thought. And I thought that was a good recognition that thought precedes language. And in The Great Influenza, it also makes me super aware of how in the past, the hierarchy of the church and the way they can subdue the masses was by saying, you will be saved. Instead of being cured, you would be saved. And for medicine is really relatively new in terms of a scientific exploration in the maybe 100 years or so ago, that there wasn't even exams for doctors. You didn't even need a high school education for doctors. And I understand now why my mother and father did not trust doctors, because sometimes they did worse things. They made people unhealthy. And so I'm feeling like this thing that we really needed to investigate and create science and create the idea of matrix to understand viruses and things like that. But I think we're going into these closed circles, like religion was a closed circle where all the answers were one answer, like you were either good or bad, you were going to be saved. And now it's going to be, instead of being cured and saved, the final answer will be, you will be billed. So we're becoming this closed matrix.
Yeah, there's this, with the word religion, we have the same problem we have with a lot of these other important words, which is everything that we call a religion a religion? Could some of them be, could there be you-religions and dis-religions? Could there be anti-religions? What are the defining characteristics of a religion? And you start asking, you'll find nobody can agree on what we're even talking about. Their definitions don't agree. And when you look at how different Greek polytheism related to other religions compared to the way that medieval Christianity related to other religions, you can see that you're really talking about things that are fundamentally different. One of them was trying to tame the ego and drive people to be questioning about the world, to dilate their understanding of the world. And one of them is telling people that only one way is right, everybody else is wrong, and you should exterminate them. The sooner that you get rid of them, the better. And you got to ask, are both of these things a religion just because we use the same word? Or are we misusing the language in some way? And what are the possibilities for how people can organize themselves? What are the possibilities for how human beings could hold something sacred in order to tame their own ego, in order to remind ourselves that there's something bigger than we are, not for other reasons, not for totalitarian reasons, but just to get this thing harnessed so that it's not such a problem. You can see a role for religion that's completely independent of supernaturalism, for example. And it could even be independent of whether it's organized or not, but just that there is this problem of meaning that directly affects the behavior of Verstand and the spirit and the ego in human beings that really needs a crutch to stop it from becoming carcinogenic. And if we kick that crutch out, like early moderns did, we, reap the whirlwind. This idea that culture isn't just whatever we happen to do, that not everything somebody does is culture, but that some things might be culture and others might be disculture. Some things might make us more sustainable and more likely to survive as a species, while other things might make us less likely to survive. They might be less sustainable. And that one of these things might be culture and the other one might not. The other one might be an ersatz replacement for culture. These thoughts are almost impossible to think in the modern era. First of all, we're not prescriptivist about language, so we don't allow ourselves to argue about whether a word ought to mean something. We're supposed to just go with whatever the majority says. That's all our dictionaries work, right? If people say that literally means figuratively, then it does, because that's what people are doing. And if you wanted to be able to make that distinction, you're just wrong for wanting to be able to make that distinction. You shouldn't make it because the majority's not making it. And in this way, we sort of carve away the sharp tools that we need in order to make the distinctions required, to make meaningful value judgments, and to develop strategies for life and for civilization. And the whole time we're doing it, we think we're being reasonable and accommodating and nice and modern. And it's like we can't quite see what it is we're doing to ourselves when we blunt all of our tools and blur up the whole picture.
Right. Okay, religion and science are the two grand opposite methods or tools of existence.
Mm-hmm.
I always argue the method against the worldview. People seem to treat methods as, they say science is a worldview. And I say, no, that can't be wrong. That can't be right, sorry. How can science be a worldview if the scientific method is exploring what the truth is?
Mhm.
How can you prejudice what the truth is with your method? So science is saying, I'm exploring. But yeah, religion, to my mind, religion and science are two very opposite methods. Science deals with analysis. Religion seems to be a sort of synthesis, which doesn't really go that much into analysis.
It's emotive.
Well, religion is mysticism, it's allowing yourself to be impressed
Mhm.
by the circumstances, what's going on. Like there's a big cosmos out there. What is it saying to me? Whereas science is trying to pull the whole thing apart.
So there's, one of the ways to think about that question is, do we have a representative sample of the possibilities of religion? Or are we attempting to draw conclusions about the possibilities of religion based only upon what modernism allows religion to be? Now, are we seeing religion? Aristotle said to evaluate something, you have to see it in its most fully realized, healthiest state. And the question is there any religion in a healthy state? Can there be a religion in a healthy state under modernism? Or are we seeing forms of religion that have been bent to comply with modernist dogma as warped as other things that modernism works? In which case it would raise questions about whether we can fairly assess the possibilities of religion. And for me, the most telling epiphany about this possibility that I might not even know what religion is. I might only know what the debased forms of religion are under modernism, is when I read Gilbert Murray's Five Stages of Greek Religion. Gilbert Murray's great classicist, great writer. It's paperback. You can get it, you can read it, and he talks about 5 stages that it went through. And one of the things that becomes clear is that this thing about the Greeks saying, if I meet another culture with a different religion, I don't want to exterminate it. Whereas in the medieval era, if they met a culture with a different religion, they did want to exterminate it. Medieval Christianity and modern Christianity are very totalitarianizing. There should be only one religion, it should be Christianity. And it's not the only religion that does that. A lot of modern religions do that. A lot of them have a we're right and everybody else is wrong approach. You can see exceptions to it. You can see interfaith alliances. You can see ecumenical movements, but they're all pushing against thousands of years of momentum that goes the other way, right? So like this was the rationalization behind the boarding schools for Native Americans, that they should not be allowed to have their religion. It should be wiped out. And if they could all just comply with the same one religion that we said was the right one, then we might allow them to survive, but otherwise we'd have to stamp them out. This kind of impulse to purify, and that there can only be one source of truth and it's an infallible source, and therefore we don't need any other sources, they're redundant. That this idea is a particular expression of religion. The idea that the ancient Greeks not only didn't do that very often, but really didn't do it at all, is hard.
But they might be right. Do it to them before they come back at you and try to do it to you.
But setting that aside, setting aside survival strategy, just looking at the fact that for polytheism in ancient Greece, their reaction to discovering a different religion was never, let's go stomp it out, let's go convert them all. They really didn't care about conversions. What they wanted to do was they wanted to learn how that other religion worked, to figure out if the Greeks were missing any gods. The Greeks were relentlessly matching up their gods with other religions' gods, trying to see if they'd accounted for them all. And if they were missing one, then they said, oh my God, we're missing one. We have to add that to our collection. Because if there's some great power over us that has authority over human affairs and we don't know about it, it means we might stumble under the wheels of the great steamroller and be exterminated. We need to learn what they know.
Right. You're bringing in the unknown God, but wasn't part of Socrates' condemnation was introducing foreign gods?
Instead of the Olympian gods. If he did it in addition to the Olympian gods, he would have been fine.
Oh, right.
He was trying to displace the authorities that they already agreed on. But the Greeks always wanted to add more outside the Olympian pantheon. So, you have to think about how different would a religion have to be to have that reaction to discovering other religions compared to what we know about from religion from today. It's a really different mindset. I mean, really almost 180 degrees diametrically opposed. And I'd never imagined that as a possibility. As a teenager growing up, I'd never imagined that as a possibility for religion. And so when it's really sank in, when I finally really grokked that there had been religions that were so different from what we see today, that's when I began to think, maybe I just don't know even what the possibilities for religion are. Maybe there are more possibilities than I could imagine from my perspective as a modern. So it sort of opens me up to the Kenneth Smith idea that you really need radically different perspectives to get to triangulate upon reality. Because no matter how smart we are, no matter how educated we are, we're always coming from some very narrow part of the cosmos and trying to imagine what the whole thing is from the tiny slice that we're seeing. And that goes for things like religion as well as anything else. It's hard to know for sure what a religion could be when all we have is a limited set of samples. Phil, you got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I wonder about that because it seems like there is a difference between monotheistic religions and multi-dimensional religions. But then I wonder, like, why is it that the ones that survive that are very dominant are pretty much monotheistic? I mean, even Buddhism in a way is monotheistic. You have the Buddha, you have a bunch of Buddhist sophists, I mean, which are like saints, but they're not like the source. I mean, it's so it's kind of interesting maybe there is deep down within us something about survival and eliminating the others in a funny way that becomes a dominant situation. I don't know, you know, and I don't know whether if that is deeper in history that eventually, you know, allow others to exist, and that ultimately, you know, like maybe that's why there's only one sort of human beings left. I have no idea. You know, they say maybe it's intermarriage, but it could just be like, you know, we survive better, or we ended up killing all the other ones because they kind of got in our way, or they sort of like was less efficient, so like they couldn't compete. I'm not quite sure, but why is it the case that the dominant ones, you know, whether, well, Judaism is not that dominant, but it's dominant enough that Christianity and Islam are incredibly big religions, you know, and then you have Buddhism, which is got multi dimensions, but it's still the Buddha, you know, even though he didn't want to be a god. He told him, "Don't make me a god," but nonetheless, he became the monotheistic God that stood in front of everybody. So why is that the case? Why is it that I guess there's Zoroastrianism still left, but that's kind of monotheistic. So why is it like the Native Americans, all these things that are multicultural, they eventually disappear? Is that partly because the growth of civilization needs to be unified? Because, you know, like even Alexander or the Romans to a certain degree allow the native culture to survive in spite of, you know, they just want to cut off and be imperial at top, but they allow the native culture to pretty much survive. Why is it at some point it needs to be so centralized, you know, like Rome is the place or whatever, you know, like I think there's something within us that is that way, that's why it's so hard to fight against it, you know, that it becomes sort of crystallized in a kind of like singularity form. So I don't know. I mean, that's a question. I'm certainly interested in why that is the case. You know, you would
May I
think
try
that
to answer that?
you would think that a multicultural thing would, in a sense, be more dynamic. I don't know.
I think that religion and politics are intertwined,
Yeah.
and it is a tool for control.
Mhm.
And if you remember the evolution of Christianity, even the construct of the Bible, when Constantine thought it was an easier way to control people, he adopted Christianity. And whereas religion tries to appeal to whatever it is inside us, our sense of mystery, it's also a way to control a populace politically. And I think monotheism is easier to represent one deity than multiple deities because it's a singular ideology. And that's easier to control. And I think, I'm not a historian, but through history, you can see that all along. In fact, if when I visit places like, I remember going to Tibet, and that's an incredibly poor place, but religion played a central role. The prayer wheels, the prayer flags, and in the palace, people are giving their last, I hate to say dime, because that was not the monetary currency, to this huge statue of the Buddha, right? It was the belief system, and it was all about control. And that belief system kept them from becoming revolutionaries, because they didn't have their basic room, board, and shelter met. But the hope that this figure gives you keep you in control. That's my take on it.
Certainly, you can look at the ways that Christianity was changed when it became an imperial religion.
Yes.
In order to be satisfying to the Roman emperors, some editing had to be done.
Correct.
You know, all this let's not fight stuff, they had to get rid of that. You had to become soldiers for Jesus instead of being, you know, blessed are the peacemakers. And all this let's share with each other and take care of each other stuff, that had to go. You know, they had to transform it into, the emperor is God's agent on earth, right? The divine right of kings that made the medieval era go flows right out of this idea that if you've got many gods and they have complicated relationships with each other, then you might think a whole lot about that. And that's not what we want. We want you to obey. So we're just going to put one thing on top and we're going to equate it to our one person in charge politically. And so, that one divine authority grants singular secular authority, and that's why you shouldn't disobey the emperor, because if you do, God hates you and he'll send you to hell. There's like these warpages that happen in order to turn a religion inside out and make it be an instrument of empire. And you can see that with Buddhism. The original Buddhism of Buddha, as you say, was not about deifying Buddha. It wasn't about there's one guy and he's the salvation. That was more or less the opposite of what Buddha said, right? He was trying to teach you to renounce desire and to have compassion for one another, to recognize that we all suffer, and that means we're all in the same boat together, and that we should be focusing on minimizing suffering for one another. That's not a very useful religion if you want to make an empire. It's like it gets in the way. What if people start sympathizing with the enemy? That's not okay. So you got to turn it around to, well, you personally have this thing you have to do, which is achieve enlightenment. And in order to do that, you have to go through these steps, and you have all these social obligations. And while we're at it, let's marry it to Confucianism, because that works better with hierarchies. And you sort of can see why Buddhism changed into the forms that it did historically, because they're more useful to the centralized political authorities. So, you can see some of this in another thing about early Christianity is that before it embraced Plato, like it would do later, Augustine really exemplified that. Yeah. It previously embraced Heraclitus. Mm-hmm. And Heraclitus was talking about the problem of ego. He said, man, ego is a major problem. He said to exterminate hubris is more urgent than to put out a fire if your house is on fire. He says, if your house is on fire, but you're an egotist, that's the greater threat, because you'll screw up even putting out a fire. If you're all full of yourself, right? Like you might let it spread to other houses and let the city burn down if you're all about yourself. You might only put out your own house. There's any number of ways to go wrong if your hubris is unleashed. So, that's not a very good religion for somebody who wants to say, I'm the emperor of everything and I'm almost a god and you should all do what I say. So the Heraclitean elements of early Christianity had to be shoved aside and replaced with something more congenial to centralized control. And Plato's Republic seemed to fit the spot, a nice orderly society in which dissident artists would all be purged and everybody had to do what they're told. And that we must assume that whoever's in charge is wiser than we are. We'll just declaim that we are doing this. And so don't worry your pretty little heads about, whether we're doing the right thing or not. There's these warpages. And the warpages, even though they're different in every different context, they're always appropriate to the context. They follow the path of least resistance from whatever kind of spiritual sacred ideas we started out with into something that's a useful tool for empire. And those will be the changes that happen to that religion in order for it to get adopted. And if the religion is too successful at repelling those changes, it won't get adopted and it'll be sidelined, as happened to many religions throughout history. They just weren't useful enough. They were too successful at being themselves. Why did Judaism not become the religion of the Roman Empire? It was there first, right? Why didn't it dominate? Well, because it set itself in opposition to the Roman Empire, and they were a bunch of terrorists constantly trying to stop the Roman Empire from dominating the world. And the Roman emperors looked at it and said, that's not useful to us. Let's not all switch to Judaism. And so, this kind of selection process, in hindsight, looks to us like progress. What is the process of maturation and progress that leads to monotheism naturally being superior to polytheism? But built into that is the assumption that serving empire is better than not serving empire, and that being more powerful is better than being weaker, and a whole host of other things that we don't really think about and don't examine.
I wonder if that doesn't just simply have to do with the fact of the power dynamics. In other words, like even when Assyria conquered Babylonia, I mean, the king was still a kingdom, and the king was very deferential to the Babylonian god. In fact, part of the reason why he won support from the Babylonian was because the guy previous to him was demeaning the god of Babylonia, and he went and kind of worshipped and praised that, made the gesture at least. Okay, it might not be authentic, but the gesture of like whatever, and everybody say, "Oh, this is guy. He's a good guy. He likes our God," you know. So I wonder whether, you know, like Rome was an empire because it just got so powerful that it could dictate what's going on. And so even before that, like Assyria was a pretty powerful kingdom, but it never was an empire, nor was Egypt an empire. It was just a very powerful kingdom that had many problems. So in a sense, maybe it's just a growth of power that eventually allow a kind of a monotheism to really sustain itself, because Christianity, certainly Judaism, wasn't powerful enough to be dominant. But once Rome adopted Christianity, it was like, oh yeah, okay. It did say in the Bible, "Thou shalt have no other God before me." I mean, like, that's a pretty stern warning. Like, that's it, you know. Like, skip the the multicultural theism or whatever. So I wonder whether that's just like, so the religion might be the kind of the surface structure that gives the appearance, but the real power underneath is the politics and the power of the empire itself. So
always, Phil, always.
You know, that HBO series Rome, one of the things that, if you know your Roman history, is really interesting to spot, because they did a good job illustrating it, is the way that although they were polytheists originally and nominally remained so until they adopted Christianity, in practice, what made the emperors rise is their embrace of Mars above all other gods, because they were successfully conquering. And the more they focused on the one God who was about conquering, the more they were able to purify themselves and align themselves into a great military empire. And you see this when Julius Caesar comes triumphant into Rome. He's decked out in Mars's colors. He's decked out like Mars, standing in the costume of Mars, behaving like Mars. He's equating himself with the one God that's bringing all the power to Rome. And you don't ever see him decking himself out like Vesta or Minerva or any of the other, you know, even the male deities. He's just like, they're like shoved completely to the side, so that they've become only nominally polytheistic. Or the people at large in Rome might be polytheistic, but the power structure has become monotheistic. And the god that they worship is a god of conquest. You know, it's interesting. And later they're talking about the martial virtues. And Cicero mentions the martial virtues. We martial for Mars as being better than the other virtues. And so there's this whole value system being turned over, a transformation from true polytheism into sort of an appearance of polytheism, or a nominal polytheism where you actually have one god above the others, long before Christianity gets picked up by Constantine. It's interesting. Sharon, go ahead.
I think it's Marianne first.
Oh, okay. Go ahead, Marianne.
So one of the philosophical questions in life is, who am I? And I think that it's interesting because I always say I'm a verb. I won't define myself. Yes. I believe I am a verb. Yes. But now I have a second way of saying who I am, and it's the bimodal cultural amphibian of Kenneth Smith.
Did you like that?
So I loved it. And I have to say that was worth reading. But I also wanted to talk a little bit about what Phil said with the dominant theory, because I go back to Leonard Shlain, and he talked about how when we evolved through the caveman, and we sat around, or caveman and woman, we sat around the fire pit, And we apparently we chanted. And I remember going to Blake Island, which is Indian preserve, and having a dinner at Blake Island. And the chant was repetitive, and it was really kind of to give you that sense of that communal space. And people that couldn't enter into that repetition chant couldn't understand, they couldn't get that it was a very right brain experience. And I think a lot of religions devolved because they don't get that the right brain has to be fed also. And I remember going back on the boat from Blake Island, there were some people from Washington, D.C. on that boat, and they were saying, oh, this is so boring that, you know, their song is just so boring. They couldn't get it. And they didn't have the ability to change a frequency, because I think it's very vibrational. And I also want to say that Tibetan Buddhism was pluralistic. It incorporated the Bon religion. And in it, there is some ego-taming concepts like, you know, offer victory to another person. You don't always take the victory. Sometimes you let it go. That's very ego-taming.
Right.
And I also want to say Buddhism, not Buddhism, but the Jewish religion was pluralistic. And then they chose to pick Yahweh, which is a lot like Yod-He-Voh-He is a war god. Right. And they chose the war god, and the Romans choosing the war god is also underlying this ethics of materialism over other people. And when Leonard Swain talked about the cavemen and women sitting around the campfire, he was talking about a social identification with what is familiar. And I think that we have this intrinsic in our reptilian amphibian brain, the desire to go to what is familiar. And so that's why it resonates.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, it's good stuff. You know, one of the things that Kenneth Smith talks about is the way that in modern cultures, they vary as far as how much they've purified themselves to become ultra-modern. And some cultures retain more of their older traditional values than others. And we often look at those as being countries that are more humane. They've got more, maybe more kindness, maybe a little less ruthlessness, maybe a little less tolerance for reducing everything to dog eats dog. And that in those places, because people don't understand what modernism is, because they subscribe to the dogma of progress, they believe that they are more modern by having those humane qualities than countries that lack them. But what Kenneth argues is that they are less modern. They have kept more of the older traditional values, and that makes them better countries because they're kinder to each other, because they're thinking about more than just how can I, you know, get the maximum possible return on investment. And that the most modern countries are the ones that have cut the safety net the furthest and gone that have purified the relationships into reducing everybody into being merely resources who translate into money. And so you see this with religions as well. You know, to what extent have religions gone through a modernist purification versus to what extent are they still preserving more of the older, more humane values in which there could be more things important in life than just immediate quick return on investment or advantage. And it's part of why studying lots of different religions is interesting, is you find, like you say, those kind of ego tempering or ego leashing qualities in some religions more than others. And if you look around, you can find them. And they're valuable wherever you find them. They're valuable to learn and to bring in as more approaches to try to help us rein this thing in and get ourselves into balance with the bigger picture. Sharon.
Yeah, well, talking about religions changing, I mean, we don't have to look very far. I think Christianity, particularly the evangelicals in America, Christianity has devolved into three things: immigration, abortion, and gender issues. That's right where we are right now, right? That's the bulk of Christianity, and that's the cultural change. So when you said that religions tend to reflect the culture, we're a living example of it. Now, what I really wanted to ask, though, is I read all of Kenneth Smith's essays, and I was very intrigued in the interplay between soul and spirit,
Yes,
art and ego, and how the ego interpreted the soul and the spirit differently, and the production of art. And he talked about music also. And I found all of those interesting, intriguing, confusing. So I guess in a 10-minute summary, if you can explain that for me, I'd like it.
Oh my goodness. Well, it builds right out of what Phil said earlier when he was talking about Mahler and Bruckner and Wagner. And it comes out of what Marianne was just saying a moment ago about the things you find in religions that help you to overcome the ego. So, anything that people can do can be done in either a Begriff way or a Verstand way. You can calculate your conclusions and design them, or you can feel your way towards them. You can have finite goals that you try to achieve, and when you've achieved them, you call it a success. Or you can have infinite goals that you're struggling to represent, and you may do it imperfectly, but you might get a whiff of it, so that anybody who ever encounters your work of art is struck by the relationship to something deep that they can't quite express, that they don't quite understand. And he cites Beethoven's Ninth as an example of this. When I was younger, I used to go see live performances of Beethoven's Ninth once a year. The Seattle Symphony Orchestra does it every year for New Year's. That's their New Year's Eve thing, is they do the Ninth, and you can hear why. Especially, I don't know, who has or hasn't studied kind of the history of music or music theory in this group, but Beethoven's earliest works are very classical. They're very noetic. Even though he's got a sense of humor and play in them, they remind you of Haydn and other earlier composers. But by the time his career is done, he basically ended. Music historians basically agree he personally ended the classical era of music and ushered in the Romantic era, because what he did, not even just in the Ninth, but even in the Third or the Fifth, but especially in the Ninth, is he found ways to harness music in ways that shattered your noetic expectations and put you in touch with something deep and gnosis that's hard to express, but that you feel so strongly that you want to go back to it again and again. And an example of that is that even just the way the symphony opens, right? Symphonies classically had started with a statement of the theme. Mm-hmm. There might be some brief intro, but really the point of the intro was to set you up to get to the statement of the theme. And then you were going to do sonata structure. You were going to restate the theme, and then you were going to explore variations and try to do it in a way such that when at the end you came back to the theme, it made sense that you did that. And that was sonata structure. And Beethoven, and that's very noetically appealing. You establish the pattern, you repeat the pattern to prove that it's a pattern. You do variations that please you intellectually as you see, oh yes, he turned the theme inside out. Oh, he turned it backwards to forwards. Oh, he modulated a key. Oh, he put it on different instruments, and we're back home to the theme. Yay, the end. It's an intellectually satisfying exercise to study classical, to listen to and experience classical sonata structure. But Beethoven began warping that and saying that's only the beginning, and that the whole point of that is to go somewhere deeper than that. Mm. And so starting in the Fifth, he began ripping apart the sonata structure into fragments and using the fragments to drive drama, to create, the dun 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 dun. He's driving this feeling, and he's willing to rip his melody to pieces. In fact, at one point he breaks it down to just 2 notes instead of all those notes. And then finally there's a sequence where he's just hammering a single note over and over and over at different levels of volume as he's building this crescendo. He's ripped apart the sonata structure in order to drive your emotions. And when he does that, he's pulling you out of noesis and into gnosis. You're being drawn into an experience that doesn't lend itself to analysis, but that is full of emotion, irresistible experience, right? So when he opens the ninth, he opens it sounding like the orchestra's warming up, which is the craziest thing to do. Because before that, nobody had ever thought that the orchestra warming up is part of the music. That's like the thing that happens, that's the non-music. And then we stop, and then the music begins. But instead, he starts with this sense of we don't know where we are and we don't know where we're going. And he coalesces this potent melody out of it. He turns.
He was writing like.
Go ahead, Ginny.
Yeah, I'm sorry. He was writing like this when he has lost hearing, right?
Yes.
Right. That's also interesting. That
even
he
was even at the time of the fifth, he'd lost so much hearing that he had to lay his head on the piano and feel
and hear the vibration, right? Yeah.
But by the time he came to the ninth, he couldn't hear anything. He was just totally deaf. And
so it's his mental emotion that was writing, as opposed to actually hearing the music and how it sounded.
His past experiences, his memories, his feelings, that was what was kind of driving it. And, that may have played a role in why he left behind kind of subtler, intellectually pleasing noetic structures and went for more and more dramatic structures. For one thing, you can hear them better. You can feel them better if they're more dramatic.
Right.
And so he starts thinking about the pattern of the drama instead of the pattern of the notes.
And then also possibly he's feeling much more emotional about the fact that he couldn't hear. So then that passion and emotion coming through music, maybe. I mean,
Well, let me chime in a little bit, because I love both Mozart and Beethoven.
One sec before you get on, because you can answer this too, Phil. So Beethoven, as he lost his hearing, was he writing more from the soul? Because the spirit, which is the motivator, according to Kenneth Smith, which was more subliminal, had ceased to function. So he was writing intrinsically, which is the soul. That's what I'm trying to get at, the creation.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
I think both, because I think he was also very projected into the world in that sense. So I don't think it's just the soul. It's not like Mahler. Mahler is a little bit more reserved. It was more internalized. It was mulling over things, there's a lot of uncertainty. Beethoven came out of the soul, but there was a little bit more certainty. He projected into the world, but not to the degree of Wagner. Okay, so that's important to know. Let me say something about Beethoven, because I originally wanted to speak about art, but
please go ahead.
Since you're on Beethoven, like Beethoven, I know that the symphonies pretty well. I know the concertos pretty well. Okay, so in both cases, the third was the breaking point. Because if you listen to the first two symphonies and you didn't know who they were, but you know about the history of music, you would say, that's a little different, but it sounds kind of like Mozart.
Right.
You would say, that's Mozart, but it's a little different. The same thing with the two piano concertos. The third concerto was beginning to be Beethoven. It was fully blossomed by the fourth and certainly the fifth piano concerto. Certainly the violin concerto. Oh my
God.
Okay, so I think you also got to remember that it's not quite as distinct as you say, because like Mozart was actually moving in that direction.
He was
before he died. He was actually moving in the romantic. So if you listen to the Requiem, I mean that is a fully romantic piece. Okay, and so and Beethoven loved his two minor concertos. the 20th and the 24th.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, he loved, and you know, the minor is always a little bit more internalized
Right.
than the major manifestation, because it's much more pondering and thoughtful and internalized in that sense. In fact, Beethoven wrote the cadenza, I think, for at least one of them. Yeah, Mozart. So he loved Mozart, and then but he did break away, and you know, the movement was, well, not only him, but let's say the destiny of that movement was already on his way, and so he, in a sense, wrote that, but he manifested in the most powerful way, and it captured the imagination of all the composers thereafter in the 19th century, including Wagner. I mean, including Wagner. So in that sense, he was certainly instrumental. You know, I still consider him the most important person in the 19th century, you know, despite the science and everything else that came out in that period. So I think that that's significant, that he, in a sense, had that sense of like, yes, that movement that was kind of like I said, the romantic poets were in a way already there, but he crystallized it, and they all the romantic poets, everybody loved him, and he it was, in a sense of, if you want to call it officially, it was the transitional period. I mean, the romantic period actually came after that, but he was the kind of the father figure, if you want to put it that way. If there was anybody that was instrumental in the 19th century, it was him and William Blake. Really. And so in that sense, but let me say something about Cubism, because that's something I'm thoroughly interested in.
Yeah.
What made Cubism important was that and it was to a certain degree inspired by the science at that time. Okay, that in a sense it was about seeing that the universe had an inner structure outside of the external structure. That was the main thing that was metaphorically carried. It was not that it was like doing the atomic thing and all that kind of stuff. But I think that changed the language of descriptiveness of the representation of the world essentially to, well, analytic cubism was still doing that. You know, I wish I could give a talk about that, but nonetheless, it was still analyzing the world and tearing apart and then putting it together. And so analytical cubism was still kind of a three-dimensional thing, even though it was painted on the canvas. It was painting a sculpture that was a representation of the world. You want to put it that way. It was sort of like halfway into 2D. But what happened was that language suddenly about seeing inner structure of other possibilities allow everybody to not go only into like a scientific mode of like the inner structure of the atom, but the inner structure of humanity and thought process and everything else. And it opened up such a floodgate in terms of like the language became so dynamic that there were many manifestations of it. You know, the Italian, well, they weren't fascists at that point, but essentially kind of pre-fascist, were inspired by it. You know, the Russians, somebody like Malevich was a very religious person, still was captivated by it. The constructivists, which were materialists, they were captivated by it, and like just all sort of dimension. And what happened was that eventually it kind of became classicized, right? So it manifests. And by the way, I do not dislike Mondrian. I love Mondrian. But what happened was that he purified it into the essence of what it was. And that kind of put the nail in the coffin, because in a sense, he's sort of saying, you know, this is the ultimate manifestation of the forms. And if you look at Mondrian, it's like all the parts are arranged in such a way that you have to have the whole in order to express the parts, right? So and it took somebody like Pollock to break that grid, yet retaining that grid, retaining that structure to express the human dimension of the inner psyche, which was much more multidimensional. I think that's the important point why classical cubism was so dynamic. You know, let's say for 20 years, it was very dynamic, and it just became uh, uh, honed down into a purity of a statement, and that it was very difficult to move away from. And if you look at what's called late modernism, it was really like I said, you know, when I first went to New York, I said, well, everybody thought they discovered the grid. and I said to myself, like, I mean, did everybody make these independent discoveries? But in fact, it just became, you know, a repetition of grid, and, you know, it became almost like, well, it became almost scientific in a way, you know, like the grid is the manifestation. It's like, so there was a kind of a fusion that became a kind of a static language. And so, you know, it took later artists to break away from that. So that's why that inventiveness was an important part, because it opened up possibilities, but essentially it sort of like the system sealed itself off and contained itself, which is what I gave the warning to about systems. In some sense, have a power that even though you think that you've invented the grid, no, it was their destiny. You know, was purified already. So you discover what somebody else discovered. You know, I said this can't be. You know, like everything is a grid.
Yeah.
So that's what
I'm going to agree with you about Beethoven and say it's not that he was all about the soul. It's that he'd mastered the spirit first. First, he learned all the forms and structures and proved that he could do that. And then he didn't just throw that stuff out. He leaned on it and bent it in order to do something that people, as you say, had started to do before, but hadn't really taken as far as he took it, except possibly Mozart's Requiem, which is shocking to listen to. It's just overwhelming. But Beethoven started to, part of it is that, you know, if you look at Bach, what were Bach's goals as a musician? He wanted to master an intricate form, which required an immense amount of intelligence and discipline and a huge amount of proficiency. He wanted to show off his mastery, and he wanted to entertain his patrons. And, you know, he used that to give glory to God in his church music, but he didn't fundamentally change his music when he used it for the church. It was still recognizably Bach, right? He was applying his ideas and his system to different contexts. And he wrote some wonderful stuff. I love Bach, but you can see the noesis at work. He is in some ways the most brilliantly noetic composer ever. His ability to, improv an 8-part canon, he did that, you know, just sitting down at the piano began adding extra layers, and the thing composed itself while he was, you know, roaring along on the keyboard, and nobody could believe he'd done that because it just hadn't been done before. This represents, you know, a high level of training and sophistication and systematization. And all of this had to be incorporated by the later composers. They had to figure out how they were going to account for this. But Beethoven not only mastered what he had, but changed what he had over the course of his career in increasingly radical directions to try to do something that hadn't been done before, not just to please patrons, not just to show off, although he was very worried about showing off, right? After being beaten as a kid by his dad, you know, he was a child prodigy like Mozart. He needed to please, right? That was a driver. And most people today don't know that there was another German composer, Spohr, who was composing at the same time, who was very popular. And Beethoven was always afraid that he was second fiddle, and that everybody liked Spohr. But now we don't. Most people don't even know who that is now. But you know, Beethoven was always nervous about what he thought was this other guy that everyone was going to like better than him. So it's not like he didn't have those motivations.
Well, but you could argue that Bach was a modernist in this sense, right? Because he really changed music by creating the temper intonation, right? Because it didn't fit the keyboard. The technology had changed, and he wanted to make bend the notes. So everything that you hear about Bach in one sense is like is sort of out of tune, but it's out of tune in a relationship to what technology was possible to make, and he wanted to fit it into a kind of a emerging
Yes.
mechanical system. And
Yes.
so in some sense that there was a kind of paradox, as he was very religious, but he was also very sort of modern in terms of like adjusting the notation to what is possible in relationship to the instrumentation at that time. And now we listen to it, it just seems very normal. But if you listen to like a Baroque chamber orchestra that's playing original instruments, you'll know that it sounds very different, actually. So.
Oh yeah, yeah. I love listening to Bach and Vivaldi on original instruments, chamber instruments. But
so going back to Beethoven, Rick, can I just ask you a quick question about what stage of his career did he start losing his hearing? Halfway through his career, or like?
If you think in terms of symphonies, it's very early. He was already starting to lose hearing by the time of the third.
Yeah.
And by the fifth, he was having a very hard time hearing. That's why he had to put his head on the piano, because otherwise he couldn't hear what he was playing. So, it was going early on, and that's because that was an abusive era, and his dad boxed his ears when he was a kid and permanently damaged his ears. And
so sad. Yeah.
He was a beaten child. But see, this is where this other side, the soulish side that Sharon was asking about, I think comes to the forefront in Beethoven in a way that it doesn't for a lot of other composers before that time, which is that Beethoven is a classic example of the tortured genius. He had incredible skills, but he had an enormous anxiety and pain in him from the way that he was brought up and from the fact that he was losing the thing he was best at in the whole world. And he lived under a certain kind of terror because of that. Now, you might expect that would mean that what he was going to compose is a lot of painful, angsty, stressed music. That would be the normal thing to do. But what makes Beethoven astonishing is that he coupled that with a transcendent desire to reinforce what he felt was the deep truth of life, which is that for everyone, no matter how difficult their circumstances, we're all united, not just by the pain that Buddha talks about, but by joy. We can all feel the capacity for joy, no matter our circumstances. It may be a brief joy, it may be a small joy, it may be an evanescent joy, but that capacity to be surprised by happiness, even in the darkest moments, Beethoven saw as part of our salvation as a species. And so very early in his career, he decided he wanted to set Schiller's Ode to Joy to music because it was all about that. But everyone thought he was crazy. They thought it was totally unmusical and it couldn't be done because they were all thinking in terms of rhyme schemes and rhythms and, what kind of thing could you make from that? And so he held that dream of becoming a great enough composer to being able to make a piece of music that could make you feel despair and transcendent joy in the same work and take you on a journey to the darkest places and then raise you up and make you glad to be alive. And the arc of his career was trying to get to the point where he could compose the ninth, where he could set it to music.
But it's also important to note that he worked very hard at it, what he did. Like if you look at Mozart's thing, it's as if he just knew it all along. He wrote it down, it was simple, it was easy. Weirdly, it was in that sense divine because it's sort of like, it's just whatever. But when you look at Beethoven's manuscript, there's all sorts of marks. He crosses everything out. He changes it. He worked really, really hard at it.
Right.
So the labor aspect of it, in some sense, also forecast a kind of 19th century kind of attitude that you have to get with it, not just sort of like some angel, like, oh, I think I'll just write some wonderful concerto,
right,
and it will come easy. So there was a human side that was incredibly important in terms of what he did as well, because like particularly when he went deaf, the fact that he understood things well enough that he could work it out, despite the fact that he couldn't let's try this out first, whatever. So a lot of scribbling, a lot of struggle. So the idea of the struggle became a very important aspect of what art was, instead of just like the pure, translucent exaltation of what God was given to me.
Right.
So when I view art, and I had a completely scientific education.
Sure.
One of the things I try to see is where the artist is coming from and what he's trying to represent,
Yes.
and whether it's pathos or joy or it's cultural or whatever it is. And so I found reading this when it played off the ego extremely interesting, because I thought the ego was subservient to both your soul and your spirit, and it didn't come into the mix. But that's not what I got from reading Kenneth Smith.
Right.
It's a central part of it. And now you're saying, I forgot why Beethoven had become deaf, not from his dad. I thought it was just disease. So therefore, his ego must have been pretty bruised by all of this.
Yes. 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 And, you know, other things along the way, he was the classic tortured genius. He really struggled, and his struggles on his manuscripts, and it's in his music, and you can feel it. But the fact that he wanted to not just depict the struggle and be present so that you could experience it too, but to transcend it, to transcend the struggle and take you to the heights and take you with him to the heights, is part of what makes him amazing. That he is subjugating all that Verstand education and skill to the purpose of something soulish and experiential. He wants you to experience something. He wants to evoke feelings in you as powerfully as you've ever felt them. And he's going to use every iota of his skill to set you up to bring you to that place. And it's why, you know, when the Ninth came out, he was the first symphonist to use kettle drums. They'd never been used in a symphony before. And in the second movement, when the kettle drum suddenly hit in Vienna, there was a standing ovation during the middle of the performance, because they're all like, oh my God, tuned percussion? The percussion is contributing to the melody? This is unheard of. Oh my God. Well, they should have spent some time in Africa. They would have heard it, you know, centuries before. But anyway, they were amazed. And the same thing happened when in the fourth movement, he just smashed the rules of symphony and has singing breakout. That was just unheard of.
Oh, yeah.
Opera was over here and symphony was over there, and never the two had met. And what he said is, I want you to experience joy, not just as a feeling, but also as an idea without the words I can't bring your Verstand along with. I want to bring your gnosis and your noesis together in the full comprehension of joy. So I need those words and I need those singers, and I'm going to smash the rules of symphonies. And I'm going to introduce this astonishing choir who are going to do these amazing things. Again, Vienna, who was highly educated music goers, they freaked out at the Ninth. They just thought that was amazing. And he had poured so much of himself into it that at the end of the performance, you know, conducting, he turns away because he's too afraid that it'll be a failure and that everyone's just going to sit there staring at him, or that they'll boo him. And meanwhile, they leap to their feet, and it's just the longest applause ever. And somebody finally had to go up on the stage and turn him around so that he could see it.
How touching. What a Renaissance man. You know, I just wanted to share very, very quickly. I was a little girl in Korea at the age of 7 or 8 years old, maybe, yeah. And I didn't speak any English or anything, but in this little tiny Korean town school, the music teacher had in his classroom 3 pictures: Bach, Mozart, and Beethoven. And I remember looking at these 3 pictures and couldn't take my eyes off of Beethoven's expression, the face. It was just so dramatic. I can still remember just looking at that face as a little girl in Korea when I didn't speak any English. I wasn't trained in Western classical music per se or anything. I just remember that expression on that Beethoven's face. And then many years later, I find out about his hearing loss and what traumas he went through in his life.
Yeah.
Now, one last thing I want to say is when I think about art and a tortured soul, the piece that springs to mind is Guernica. I think that's by Picasso.
Yes.
And that piece of art represents just torture. And I think it is Cubism too, if I remember, Phil, right?
It's a later form, but it is Cubism, yes.
Yes. And it is, you can see his tortured soul, which he tried to put on canvas after the bombing.
Right.
The animals in there too. It's,
Yes.
yeah.
And
Yes.
I think that there was a, like, Cubism moved to abstraction earlier than he wanted to, and he never got rid of the representation totally. And I think that is a reason, because he does not want to lose a tie to a kind of a regular representation on certain level, even though I have reduced it to a kind of mere object matter. But that was important. Whereas like Vladimir Tatlin, like I said, took it the next step, and in a sense, it said, get rid of the object matter, get rid of the apples and oranges, and just do the structural mental process of creativity, right?
Yes.
Which he never wanted to get rid of. So that was an important distinction.
Mm.
Yeah, Guernica, Sharon, that's a great example. It's Cubism had been around for a while, as Phil said at that point, but rarely had it been used to such emotional purpose as in Guernica. And not just emotional, but moral purpose. He wanted you to hate that war and hate what was done. He wanted you to feel that pain. And he had mastered Cubism, obviously, given his background. But as with what Beethoven did to classical music to create the Ninth, he did that to Cubism to create Guernica. He stretched it and bent it to make you experience something, because for him, having you appreciate it noetically was not enough. It couldn't do justice to what happened at Guernica in an intellectual, abstract way. He needed you to feel it.
Well, you couldn't experience that in that dimension without the symbols.
That's right.
The symbols, it was important to him
That's
to
right.
retain at least some resemblance to the symbols.
Right. And so this is why many people who don't care about classical music can still be moved by Ode to Joy. It's full of emotion. It's full of experience, and countless people who just can't appreciate Cubism can still be moved by Guernica, because it's not just an intellectual exercise. It's potent with emotion, but also with meaning, with profundity. It reaches into the infinite. That means these are aristic works of art. They're full of Vernunft. They go beyond Begriff and Verstand. They unite gnosis and noesis. They take all the skill of noesis, all the training, and then turn it around to make it serve deep gnosic purposes, so that it overwhelms you and takes you to the place that, not just that the artist wants to take you to prove that he can do it, but to take you somewhere that we need to be able to go. We need to understand the Spanish Civil War. We need to understand that despair is never the whole picture, that there's always joy too. If we don't understand those things, we can't be fully human. And so the artists in this case are doing something eristic, which is really rare in the modern era, to have something that so purely stands out from the crowd in its eristic qualities. And that's why he's citing this stuff here. It takes the soulish side of us, which is suppressed under modernism, in favor of the egotism, the spirit and egotism of Verstand, and it puts it back into the picture as a critical component, and says the experience of life matters, the meaning of life matters, the feeling of life matters at least as much as what we think about life and our recipes for life and our stratagems. So that's why he's citing this art as part of this. That's where the soulish spiritual side comes in. And it is a specifically Hegelian, Kierkegaardian, Nietzschean, Smithian thing to do, to equate ego and spirit, to put them together and say they may not be identical, but they're very closely related to each other, because spirit is soul in motion, it's soul with intent, and intent is ego. The ego decides to change the world or change itself. It sets up its programs for what it's going to do, and it puts the soul in motion, making it into spirit. This is using medieval categories and definitions of soul and spirit. and this is the thing that most shocked me about Kenneth Smith's philosophy early on, is that the medieval stuff, which I'd been trained to despise, could be such a source of meaning and understanding about human character. That these two sides of our mind are both at work and have a relationship to each other that's so important to who we are.
So can you
Very
say that
interesting,
again?
Rick.
Spirit is soul in motion and ego is the intent. That's what you said?
So I said spirit is soul in motion, and soul in motion is in motion according to intent, and it is ego that has the intention. If you just want to merge with the whole and experience life, you're being soulish. But the moment that you decide that you want to change things, that you want to set boundaries, that you want to create things, you're engaging in spirit, because the soul is now in motion to transform the world, not just to merge with it. Oh. And that operation, that operation of spirit is driven by ego. Ego is the part of us that decides, that constructs, that plans, that can imagine something more than merging, more than experiencing. So spirit is a consequence of ego.
Well, I might put it in slightly differently. I think that for soul to express itself through spirit, you have to have the sort of unconscious emerge in at least a semi-conscious way in order to manifest itself in the world. Yes. And I think so therefore that's why I would call it a kind of pre-language, but it is a kind of language that allows you, otherwise, like, you might as well keep it to yourself because nobody's going to understand it. That's right. People do understand language and it has its problem, but a pre-language allow enough sort of ambiguity that it doesn't trap itself under the structure of language totally, but it gives you at least appearance. That's why I brought up Bruckner. I mean, Bruckner, like, oh, it's coming. Like, no, it just disappeared already. So Bruckner wanted to be, but he didn't push hard enough for it to manifest itself in the world.
Yes.
So
how do you feel, Rick?
I'm okay.
Oh, okay. Just wondering. I just want to ask you that before. I just want to ask you that before we, split off. So
yeah.
So I have one other thing, because what you said, Rick, just kind of really summarized it for me, which is what I've been searching for, and I've read those 7.4 and 7.5 a bunch of times. However, I also read ahead to 7.6, where you said soul is not spirit. And that is, I found that equally profound. So I don't know if we're going to skip over that. And then the 7.7, spirit and soul, yin and yang. I like that very much.
Yeah. That's important. That's important. Yeah, that's very important.
And so I don't know if we're going to skip over that or if we can just spend some time digesting that, because the interplay of soul and spirit and ego and music and art was very, very important to me. So I had to pick things out of my brain, which I thought demonstrated it. That's why I brought up Guernica. Yes. That cemented it in my mind. So I don't know what we're going to discuss next week, but the one about soul is not spirit is very interesting.
Yeah, we're going to go through this methodically. So we'll next week we'll pick up in soul, ego, and art, and wrap it up and move on to spirit, ego, and art.
Okay.
And then we'll keep going after that, because the things that you're talking about are that's why David and I really wanted this essay in this book. Because the things that he says about soul and spirit and their relationship to the structure of the mind and thinking are things really no other philosopher I know of in the modern era writes about. These are antique terms that philosophers have largely abandoned in the modern era. And he picks them back up. And he brings in Hegel and Kierkegaard and Hannah Arendt and others in order to, but he reaches back to Aquinas and Constant and Augustus and others to help to make a continuous concept, so that these aren't just idiosyncratic definitions, but that we learn them in a way that traces their lineage all the way back, and kind of see a new way of thinking about them.
Well, for me, what caught my attention, it was the creative structure of the mind.
Yes.
That I found was emphasized here.
Yes. And it makes sense that he would, because he's an artist. And
Oh.
someday I got to get some of his art in order to show on these.
Yeah, I didn't know that. So Phil, I want to know what your website is. Could you put it in the chat so I can go look at your art?
Well, why don't I just give it
to
to you, because I don't know how to work the chat even. That's how.
Okay, what is it?
It's very easy. philchan.com. No, philchanart.com. One word, philchanart.com. So it's just my name and art.com. You see it.
Because I think these weeks of interaction, you get to know a little bit about your personality. So I wanted to look at your art to see what kind of reflection that was. Forgive me, but I'm extremely analytical, right?
Do we get a discount?
That's my life. So it's Phil Chan, Phil
Art.
with one L, chanart.com. And it's
That's
Phil
right.
with one L. Okay.
There's one word, obviously. There's no space in between.
Yes. Okay. Thank
So
you.
Marianne, you had your hand up for a while. Do you want to comment?
So I wanted to comment on something that's going to open a whole new topic, but I wanted also to talk about how Rick said that spirit is soul emotion according with intention. And I wanted to take that intention from a noun into a verb. So we're intending inside ourselves.
Yes.
And that's how we get the juice.
Yes.
That's the ego. Yeah. Yes, that's right. That's
Why
nice.
don't we pick up exactly with that next week? We'll
You got to
continue
write it down, Marianne.
right there. Yeah.
Very good.